In the misty mountains during a snowstorm, a group of people gathered around a campfire to keep warm, but not all of them ended up alive after a great fight that occurred. One of the men asked how he could escape from those bindings, especially with only the brute strength of his body. That question made no sense now. After all, that man wouldn't be able to understand him anyway. The man continued hunting everyone around the fire with his sword, and in a foreign tongue he introduced himself as Urick. He was Urick of the Stone Axe tribe. Challenged by the tribesmen, the soldier also drew his sword, saying that Urick might be a barbarian, but being such a skilled warrior, he should also be capable of understanding honor. The knight introduced himself as Portugal Arton, and Urick recognized him because he would remember his name. The two ran toward each other to begin fighting again. Arton thought about how that guy was a stupid barbarian. He would knock his sword away with his shield and finish him off while he was defenseless. But to Arton's shock, Urick's sword flew far away after being discarded. Urick said he couldn't be defeated, especially not by a man like Arton, and struck him using only his fists, enraging the knight with his boldness. He returned the punch, trying his hardest to kill his opponent. After finally some time exchanging blows, Urick finished him off with his sword, acknowledging that his opponent's skills weren't actually bad. He had simply faced the wrong opponent, who happened to be stronger than him. When the battle was over, Urick took a deep breath in the mountain cold, then collapsed backwards, feeling dizzy and exhausted. He had heard a voice saying that Urick would become a great warrior. At the time, Urick believed it was nothing more than a bunch of foolishness. He didn't believe in those things from shamans and divinations. She was just saying those things because she was lost in her medicine. The shaman replied that she had a vision in the middle of a nightmare. She saw him becoming a warrior of light after a great bloody battle. But Urick laughed, suggesting she should just give up being a shaman already. That irritated her because she was called an old woman when she still had plenty of time left. Urick got annoyed too and stood up to leave after calling her senile. She asked if he planned to go hunting again with the warriors of his age group. The chief's son would end up getting jealous if he did that. Urick retorted that he never wanted to fight for the chief's position to begin with. The shaman mentioned that even thinking that way, the others still thought differently. Even if he said he didn't want it, no one could force him into it. Either way, Urick reminded her to take good care of her old body. The two parted ways, but she kept looking at his back. The protagonist soon met up with some other hunters from his tribe. One of them complained that he was late and asked if he was with the shaman again. He replied that he wouldn't sleep right if that old woman died alone. Then they asked if they were really going to climb the celestial range that day. The world beyond the range was full of souls, and everyone was uneasy. If they crossed the range, they might never come back. Urick responded that these days, the chief's son had captured a wolf the size of a calf. They would have to climb the range if they wanted to catch prey bigger than that. Therefore, they couldn't stay behind and delay just because they were scared. Even so, they were all still uneasy since the celestial range was a bit dangerous. The protagonist insisted as even the adults only went as far as the base of the range. They would just hunt there too and make things work. If they didn't want to go, they could turn back if they were cowards deep down. The provocation worked well, and now they were all full of motivation. They wouldn't allow themselves to be called cowards and decided they would climb too. Then they agreed that whoever came last would have to carry the carcass on the way back. Time passed, and the group climbed the range, seeing the horizon in the distance. They had come so far, but still hadn't even climbed halfway. Urick wondered what might lie beyond the celestial range, and asked himself if there really could be a world of the dead, as shamans and elders said. They would become souls and could fly through the celestial range when they died. While reflecting, someone pulled him from his thoughts. It was Vold. He asked if Urick really didn't consider becoming the tribe's chief. The protagonist grumbled that, as he had said hundreds of times, he had no interest at all. He hated how the chief's son acted like he was special when he wasn't, and Vold replied that that's exactly why they thought Urick should become the chief. If the chief's son became the next chief, maybe he could follow his orders. Urick replied that he certainly wouldn't like that, getting irritated just by imagining it. With that, Vold mentioned that if he wouldn't follow the chief's son's orders, then he would have to become the chief, and Urick told him to shut up, saying he'd think about it later. No matter how much they thought about it, they always believed Urick was the most suitable. Suddenly, the protagonist noticed something in the forest and shouted for everyone to get down. Even so, the vast majority of them were shot in the chest and back with arrows. Urick shouted for them to load their arrows and prepare to shoot back. Not only that, but even Vold was struck directly in the chest with an arrow. He wondered who the attackers were. Maybe another invading tribe. Then he saw how the arrowheads were sharp and elaborately crafted. He had never seen anything like that in his entire life. That was when he realized it was different. When he turned around, he found several men who were armed soldiers in armor. The enemies had even greater range than they did, and they were also on much higher ground than the tribe's group. It was Urick who had said they should go deeper into the mountains. He had to take responsibility and help his men, so he ordered Vold to take the wounded and go back first, because he would hold them off. Vold replied that he couldn't run and leave him behind. They were like brothers, after all. But Urick grabbed him by the face, telling him to do what he was saying. It was better for him if they weren't there anymore anyway. They should descend the mountain before he crushed that stupid head. Dying together was important, but saving their brothers was also at stake. Though bothered, Vold did as he was told, asking Urick to come back alive. Then, Urick replied that he should know what the old shaman had said earlier, about how he would become a great warrior. This would not be the place where his bones would rest. He was Urick of the Stone Axe tribe after all. Even searching, he couldn't pinpoint the enemy's location from there. Instead, he would find them by throwing his spear. Then he would run in the same direction as fast as he could. Urick began to retaliate against the soldiers' attacks with his own arrows. Soon, he found the person who had been hiding in the forest. However, he quickly heard voices and realized it was a completely different language. Besides that, they were people wearing clothes he had never seen before. They were certainly humans who had come from the other side of the mountain. Urick asked them if they came from beyond the mountain, but the soldiers only spoke among themselves, asking if the others had fled. Seeing how far he had come, he was clearly not a normal guy. He couldn't lower his guard now, and Urick couldn't understand their words. But even without understanding their words, that didn't matter. The moment they laid hands on his brothers, their fates were sealed. Suddenly, a voice shouted for them to lower their bows. The one who spoke was Arton, relieved that he had put on armor just in case. The other men approached, reminding him that they could kill Urick. But Arton refused. They should capture the one who remained alive. It would be a fine gift to His Imperial Majesty to celebrate the discovery of a new land. Arton's entire body was covered with metal plates. It seemed they still had plenty of iron to refine and use to their advantage. Then the soldier set aside his shield to the shock of the other men. It was only the axe of a barbarian. It couldn't pierce his armor. Urick didn't know what was happening, but he saw that the man had discarded his shield, and it seemed the man had great confidence in his defense. Arton used the grip of Imperial fencing during the battle. Then the protagonist became curious because he was holding his sword backward. He was feeling underestimated and wondered if they were trying to capture him alive. It was the first time Urick had ever been so insulted by others to this extent. Soon, Arton charged at him right away, landing a solid blow with his axe. To Arton's shock, the blade of the axe got stuck in his visor. He had aimed there, throwing the axe full force and managing to hit. A mere barbarian was strong enough to shock even Arton. That enraged the soldier, who became even more furious than before. Once again, the soldier was caught off guard because his attacks were dodged. Urick charged at him with bottling movements and attacked. He retrieved his axe again and prepared to finish the fight. The other men shouted in concern and got ready to shoot to protect Arton. They shot their arrows into Urick's back and tied a rope around his neck. They were going to finish by tightening it, so he'd lose consciousness and be unable to use his strength. And to think he had thrown his axe to knock off the helmet and then aimed at the head. Arton was shocked and ordered the barbarian to get up as it started to snow. Meanwhile, Urick was in great pain and could barely see. The others noticed that the barbarian was dizzy and worried that he might die before being delivered to His Imperial Majesty. They really were people from the other side of the mountain. Now Urick was sure. The men talked among themselves at their base about the situation. Arton had gone out to get fuel. They had to hurry and set up camp before he returned. The protagonist smiled. There was a completely different world of humans beyond the range. It wasn't actually a world for the souls of the dead. He felt like he could freeze to death with how much it was snowing. It was true. That miserable cold was the reason the warrior tribe never crossed the mountains. Suddenly, Urick began to laugh, drawing the attention of the other men. They wondered what was wrong with that guy for acting like that. That's when everyone was shocked because Urick stood up after freeing himself from his bindings. Laughing, Urick said they should feel free to boast when they were dead. The person they killed earlier was Urick of the Stone Axe tribe. It didn't take long for Urick to strike down all the men with his axe. The Eastern Range was his homeland, and the battle ended. Beyond it was an unknown world ready to be explored. Meanwhile, in the forests, a man was desperately running from several others. The men chasing him started laughing, not believing he could escape. They shouted to the others to bring a sword. They'd start by cutting off his fingers. The man on the ground begged his brother to let him go just this once. While he was begging, the group suddenly noticed someone approaching from the woods. The man pleaded for him to save him, saying he could offer a reward. The one who was there was Urick, and the others approached him, asking what he wanted there. Otherwise, he could just go away. The protagonist spoke in another language, and he knew they wouldn't understand. But they could go on doing what they were doing. He was just curious to see what their intentions were. The men noticed Urick had to be a foreigner. It was the first time they had heard that language. They laughed, saying he was probably some hillbilly from the south. Even so, they told him to scram because he was ruining their moment. Maybe he wanted to die there, far from his homeland and being a nuisance. The two stared at each other for a while before Urick brought the man down. The others were shocked because that guy had twisted Max's neck. Urick replied that they were the ones who started by trying to pressure him. But immediately, the other two rushed at him in an instant. It took no more than a few seconds for Urick to finish taking them down. The one left on the ground wondered who exactly that guy was, and curled up begging for mercy. But Urick didn't attack him. Instead, he drew on the ground to try to communicate with the man. He asked him to take him to where his tribe was. Urick was guided by the man in the direction of a city, and he told him that the city he was seeing was called Ankora. Ankora was a city built at the base of a copper mine. It was so big it actually took his breath away. Urick looked around, surprised by the large number of people there. The man thought he was a traveler, but he barely knew anything about this world. The two went to a bar and the man asked where Urick was from. The protagonist didn't understand his words, so the man looked for help. Maybe someone nearby could speak his language, so they could communicate. Around them, others said they couldn't understand a thing he was saying. But he did seem to be from the north, maybe from a distant groups. Since he couldn't speak the language of the Empire, he probably was from a remote place. They agreed that northern barbarians were all huge like him. People from the south were small and thin like women. In the end, they asked if he came from the other side of the celestial range. Urick thought that if they found out he came from the other side of the celestial range, their attitudes toward him might change. He would have to be very careful. Then the man mentioned that if they found a translator, they could talk. But for now, he would buy something for Urick to drink. The protagonist saw the coins, not understanding what they were. They seemed to have been hand-forged from the amount of detail, and it looked like he was trading the coins for cups of drink. Then Urick realized it was different from when they traded dried meat and leather in the tribe. It was based on a monetary system and not on bartering. That made him smile, quickly understanding that it was trade. They spent some time inside, and Urick observed the people around. The weapons there were much better than the ones he was used to using, which meant their iron forging was much more advanced than theirs. The other man noticed that Urick was fascinated by another customer's axe. He pointed at it, asking what he had to do to get one of those axes. The man was confused until he realized Urick was talking about the axe. He probably was some criminal who had to flee from home. The man figured he probably didn't have any money with him, so he pointed to the coins on his counter to make him understand. He might be a strong guy and good at fighting. If he used his head well, he could take advantage of him all he wanted. Urick realized he would indeed need to get more of those round things. By the way, the man asked if he wouldn't like to make even more money, so the two of them went to the battle arena of Ankora. Now the protagonist understood he was just supposed to beat everyone up without using weapons. The man kept communicating with him using drawings, explaining that he couldn't kill them, it was just fights for money. The man kept insisting on that when Urick entered the arena. Then he wondered what he'd do if they died from just a light tap. But there was no way the other man could understand him anyway. Everything on the other side of the eastern range started and ended with money. The men there were all weaker than him, and Urick knew it well. Soon the fight began and the protagonist dodged the incoming attacks. Even though they were gladiators fighting in an arena, they were all slow compared to the warrior tribe. Soon, Urick brought him down with a swift movement and made him fall. This was not a place where one fought with their life on the line. There were no real warriors there. The others watched in shock. The champion was brought down with just one blow, but the man who sponsored him was happy. As expected, Urick was powerful and could be used to make money. Urick remembered Arton, who fought him before in the mountains. He was a real warrior, prepared to die there, so that meant he could still find another real warrior out there. The next day, the protagonist woke up after sleeping at the place. The other man came into the room telling him to hurry and get up, because they needed to make their money that day too. He had been walking around for many months and got a lot of credit at the tavern, so they couldn't mess around, let alone buy an axe now. He pulled him by the arm to make him hurry because everyone was waiting. Urick told him to shut up. His voice was giving him a headache. He couldn't understand his words to begin with either. As they were leaving, he noticed a sword on the chair. The two of them went to the battle arena where everyone was saying he was amazing. They were cheering for Urick to win again as the invincible one. The man sponsoring him was sure his money-making machine was invincible. That day, Urick faced an opponent he thought was just another weakling. He could end it with just a punch to the jaw and there'd be no problem. But to Urick's surprise, he took a full punch to the stomach. Even though he thought he had dodged, he felt the pain full force. He wondered if he was getting rusty somehow or something like that. Annoyed, Urick delivered a full punch to the man's face, knocking out a tooth. The others got worried because the guy might have died from that. The sponsor came over concerned as he had warned not to kill the others, and right away, both of them were kicked out of the arena and banned for life. He would have to find other ways to make easy money. He just hoped Urick could chill that day and not do anything. They couldn't make money in Ankora anymore. Maybe it was time to end the partnership with that guy. Meanwhile, Urick was feeling stupid. He couldn't control his strength in a simple strike. He had come down the mountain just to act like a stupid warrior. Arton and he fought, putting everything on the line in the celestial range while it snowed. The reason Urick left his home and came all the way there was to see things he never knew existed in his tribe. The days he spent in Ankora truly felt like his last moments of rest, but a warrior should rest after dying, not while still alive. The sponsor took him to another place, saying this time it was one of the big ones. He needed to do well this time and maybe it could make things work. Urick replied that he had gotten used to this place, so he thanked him for the help, while the other trusted him to make things work. The next day, Urick ended up in the arena again. He was surprised. He thought he'd never go back there since he killed someone. But his sponsor assured him he just needed to read the room carefully. When he checked, there wasn't even an audience, actually. But there were a few men there who saw Urick as soon as he entered. One of them said he must be good because he grabbed his sword and got ready. He surely had to be the type with a lot of battle experience. It was clear to the men of the arena that he was the kind worth trying. The sponsor said there was no reason to whisper like that. After all, Urick couldn't understand their language, and they decided to take that into account when calculating his value. Still, it was kind of unnecessary because Urick's skills were incredible. So Urick ended up in the arena to face an opponent. The guy said he must be a rookie slave gladiator. He was going to school him hard. The protagonist was given a wooden sword and noticed they wanted to test him. The sponsor thought he could just beat the guy down and get rich. Urick dodged the first attack, recognizing he was good, but way too slow. It didn't take long before he stole his wooden sword and handed it back mockingly. Urick called him to fight with a smile that made him furious. After knocking him down again, the protagonist dropped his wooden sword. He wished they would stop the childish games. He had been holding a sword since the age of 5. It wasn't some joke. Then other men approached saying that was enough. They offered 5 million, but the sponsor countered because he wanted 15 million. After all, they should have paid attention to what had just happened. Urick noticed there were 2 armed warriors nearby. Meanwhile, the sponsor showed the money to the protagonist. After all, they had earned a lot and were pretty rich now. Suddenly, Urick stole a real sword and chopped off his hand. The money hit the ground while the man stood there, not understanding anything. Urick told him to open his mouth because it was time to stop pretending. The man froze in shock when he realized Urick understood the Imperial language. He dropped to his knees, begging and apologizing. It was just that one time. They were friends, but Urick just gave him a wicked smile, telling him to speak slower and peacefully. He couldn't understand anything they said so fast. After finishing him off, he gave the real sword back to the other man, commenting on how they had some really sharp swords there. You could tell it had been well cared for and used with great affection. The other men just stood there frozen in shock. He was a terrifying man. They wouldn't be able to handle that beast in any way. It seemed there was some misunderstanding between them, and they were about to leave. But Urick asked where they were going. After all, they hadn't even finished negotiating with him to begin with. The man didn't know what the protagonist was talking about. Urick mentioned how they must have been needing a gladiator, and he replied that a gladiator took half the earnings from each fight. In exchange, he should be able to handle everything on his own. Urick asked about speaking Imperial, and the man smiled. It wasn't necessary at all. The two laughed and introduced themselves. The man's name was Horus. He was a slave merchant and an intermediate-level gladiator. Horus smiled as he welcomed the protagonist there in the arena, but in truth, he also started getting involved around the slaves. One of the men asked if he was someone from the north looking for someone of his race. Urick replied that he had no relation to the north. He was just bad with the Imperial language because he had lived in foreign countries. So they could all relax about that. The guy figured that because of his size, he must be from the north, but he thought he must be wrong, so the protagonist got curious, asking if all people from the north were slaves. He replied not all, but some became slaves after the northern expedition. It lasted almost 10 years. Urick asked if one of the others there was also from the north, referring to the big man nearby, and the guy laughed. He had a good eye. He managed to recognize the only man who came from the north in their gladiator troop. The man's name was Sven. He was a slave gladiator. He had survived there for more than 3 years so far. The guy who explained approached and introduced himself as Donovan. He was the main attraction of the gladiator troop, but honestly, Urick couldn't care less. However, Donovan said he could tell he was a barbarian. He could smell it on him. The protagonist asks what smell he was talking about after all. Donovan says it was the smell of a beast trying to pass as human. The smell of an animal that was only human on the outside, but still beastly on the inside. Urick laughs, saying it seemed like he was really good with smells. If his nose was like that, it actually made him a real animal. But Donovan didn't fall for the provocation and replied with a laugh. When he went out to subjugate the barbarians, he encountered many like Urick. The uncivilized tribes couldn't get that beastly stench off themselves. The protagonist asks if he was giving a monologue about himself, mocking everything he kept saying without even being asked. Urick comments that maybe it was time to introduce himself if that's how things worked. From his experience as Urick, the barbarian, they insult others too much. So he reflected on the reason behind it and realized it was because they weren't afraid of having their tongues ripped out. Even after saying so much, their heads still remained on their necks. And since their tongues were still in their mouths, they could talk nonsense again. Just then, Horus appeared to stop the fight. They couldn't die before paying off their debts. He told the two of them to lower their swords. The loser would become the winner's slave. Donovan complained but ended up agreeing that he got lucky this time. Urick laughed, asking who exactly got lucky this time. Later in the arena, he complained to Horus about the amount he was being paid. He was fighting with his life on the line, but would only receive 800,000. If everyone got paid just for risking their lives, Horus laughed. Even animals could get rich at that rate. It'd be better if he wore armor and a helmet this time. Urick saw that the old man would be his partner this time. This kind of thing only made his body heavier. The old man was the one from the north called Sven. Sven noticed he was using a good sword and asked how he got it, especially because it was made of Imperial steel. Urick had no idea what he was talking about, so Sven decided to explain. It was a kind of iron monopolized by the Imperial family. It was exceptionally stronger than regular iron, so people called it steel. Those weapons were exclusive property of Imperial knights, so it was really hard to even get a look at one. He wondered if Arden had been an Imperial knight. Just then, Donovan approached, asking if he thought just anyone could own a weapon made of Imperial steel. Horus told them all to shut up because they should just go and fight. They could make money like real gladiators were supposed to. Then Sven asked where he was from. He didn't seem like someone born and raised in the Empire. Urick replied that if he told the truth, Sven would be so shocked he'd faint. Then Sven commented on how Imperial citizens got excited. After all, they rarely went to war, they were always eager to see blood. Urick told the old man to cover the right side, and he replied that he wasn't that old, which made the protagonist joke that he should shave his beard or something. The opponents couldn't believe they came in with just one sword. He must be a really arrogant guy to act like that. Urick got ready, since the opponent seemed to have a strong defense. In less than a moment, Urick charged at him with his sword. As much as armor made the body heavier, it was bad. After all, it made them react slower and not even defend properly against his attacks. Urick took down his opponent in a matter of seconds right away. In the crowd, people were shocked by his performance. He jumped higher than the opponent's height. It almost looked like the circus. Then Urick turned to check if help was needed with anything, and wondered what exactly he was thinking. He had his guard down as if inviting the opponent to strike. No matter how fast a two-handed sword was, two hatchets were infinitely faster. This fight would end in the next strike. That's how Sven finished off his opponent in the blink of an eye. It was still too early for him to need help from a brat. Urick thought that even though the choice of weapons made sense, even so, his attack was honestly ridiculous to look at. Urick got irritated when he was called a brat right to his face. Sven replied that kind of thing only worked on people around here. From what Sven could see, he looked 17 or 18. If his son were alive, he could say he'd be that age now. But in any case, it seemed like he had survived one more day. He thought he was still far from going to the Hill of Swords. Urick thinks he must have talent and courage and wonders how someone like him lived as a slave. In the crowd, everyone screamed for Urick to celebrate. Since he asked for a one-on-two fight, they thought he wanted to die. But it seemed Urick really won. Donovan watched in surprise. Horus said there was no way he would be popular after doing something like that. He was a real gem. They could now recognize that. Urick went to talk about Sven and how he truly stood out. If he wanted, Horus would have arranged for him to become a free gladiator. But he was the one who chose to remain a slave until now. From what he knew, Horus saved his life when he was adrift at sea, nearly dying, since Horus treated him well and gave him a place to fight. From the perspective of a man from the north, that was enough to swear loyalty. Urick asked what that was supposed to mean, and the guy asked if he knew anything about the Hill of Swords, the place where northern warriors go when they die. The Hill of Swords was where their great ancestors and warriors awaited. It was a paradise where they could eat meat and drink alcohol as much as they wanted, and also fight to test their skills. People from the north were very afraid of dying from illness or accidents, because they believed only warriors who died in battle could go to the Hill of Swords as worthy. The Hill of Swords was a little different from the stories Urick had heard, but not so much when considering his homeland. The elders believed that beyond the celestial range was the world of souls, but they were all wrong. This place beyond the range was also where people lived, so he asked where their souls would go when they died, and wondered what could happen to him when he died. Urick asked his companion where he would go when he died. After all, he was a person of the Empire, so he must have different beliefs. He revealed a figure of a sun. His soul would return to Ru. The sun god was called that, and then he could be reborn. It was safe to say that all citizens of the Empire were sun believers. All the kingdoms that belonged to the Empire followed that doctrine, and also made the sun their national and well-known religion. Urick believed in the sky. The sun must be part of the sky in that sense. So that meant he believed in something even greater than the sun, and that made him laugh. Either way, people could believe in whatever they wanted. Then the man introduced himself as Backman. That night, Backman visited Urick to drink. He was wondering what he had spent that amount of money on, especially because it came from Horus' payment. But it must have been on all those axes and weapons in his room. Urick replied that one of the best things money could buy was that. Then Backman commented on how the protagonist had been there for a while, and asked if he'd thought about what was happening with the gladiators. Urick said he must be referring to Donovan's faction and the scum. He agreed because among the 21 people in the gladiator troop, 10 were from Donovan's faction. That was because he had been a soldier. According to him, he was a blade master from Purgeon's unit. Whether true or not, he was the most famous gladiator in Horus's troop, so the fact he made his own clique wasn't so abnormal. The real problem was that Donovan controlled all the important matches on the list. Donovan's faction got the easiest and most profitable matches, while the other gladiators got screwed with the hard ones. If a match was too difficult, they could just refuse. Urick said they were gladiators after all, so they had no obligations. But Backman replied that if he kept refusing, he'd eventually starve to death. So the protagonist asked why he was saying all of this. He replied that if a new gladiator appeared with the same influence as Donovan, he wouldn't be able to change the match list however he wanted. Urick replied that if he hated him so much, he could just become the new star gladiator. That's when Backman revealed he had been transferred to the leader's team. That was why he was placing all his hopes on Urick. Although Urick replied that he didn't like people who used others for money. Still, if the law of nature said a fox should help a lion catch a wolf, there was nothing he could do now except obey. Besides, it wasn't like he hated that in Backman to begin with. The moment he stepped into this civilized world, Backman was the first person who spoke to him, and he also treated him really well as a true human being. If someone shows you kindness, that person should be repaid double. Bachman began to feel ashamed of those words. Then he said they could start making a plan about what to do from now on. Meanwhile, Donovan was talking with Horus. They knew Betrayal would end up buying and using the death sentence prisoner this time. They could put Wallen, Asvel, and Caton with the prisoners. Horus replied that fighting alongside a condemned prisoner was basically a free pass. He should know those were basically execution matches. His would be the final match. His opponent would be one of Betrayal's slave gladiators. At that moment, the protagonist entered the meeting room, stating that they could leave things in his hands, because he would create a river of blood that would make everyone there faint. Donovan gets irritated and glares at him, and Urick smiles, to which Horus sighs. If they wanted to fight, they could do it outside. He would stop anything that wasn't a fist fight, though. Urick didn't understand the reason they actually needed to go fight. He was only interested in the match list. But Donovan gets angry and tells him to leave before he kills him. The protagonist ignores him and approaches Horus to talk. He wanted to be put in the match, and Donovan immediately protests. He didn't care what a filthy guy like that asked them to do. Still, Horus responds that the final match was the most important of all. Urick knew that very well, and Horus questioned the reason for acting that way. But instead of telling the truth, Urick says it would be 5 people. He would fight 5 people, whether they were gladiators or prisoners. Everyone would want to see that match, even if just out of pure curiosity. Horus retorts that if he dies, it would become a huge problem. Actually, Urick guarantees that he could be trusted to win. He had never lost a fight before, even if it was 5 or 10 at once. There's a big difference between a 5-on-1 fight in the street and 5-on-1 in the arena. That was how Horus argued. He had potential, but didn't need to exaggerate that much to be truthful. Donovan then replies that he could let him go in his place. He could put him in the final 5-on-1 match, which irritates Horus. Urick laughs. He had no idea the dear gladiator had such a generous heart, but still thanks Donovan before starting to provoke Horus. After all, there shouldn't be a problem asking him to fix up the match list. He could make a big show out of his fight against 5 and all the rest. Sighing, Horus realized there was nothing he could do at that point. He ends up agreeing to grant the final match as requested. To Urick's delight, he was now glad he had come there. Conversations and comments about Urick spread among the people, about how he had won several times in a row. He was a real monster. But facing 5 opponents seemed like madness. They hoped the fight wouldn't end quickly. Meanwhile, Urick was talking to some other men. One of them spoke of a lake as big as the sky that could flow constantly, and they couldn't even see the end of it. Urick didn't want to believe it because he had never seen an ocean in his life, and thought they were all just making fun of him for never seeing it. Sometime later, Bachman showed up just at the right time. He was from the eastern city of Harbor, and they told him to tell Urick about it. But Bachman shouted furiously at Urick, calling him crazy. This was serious death. He should cancel that match before it was too late. If he ended up dying, he would feel guilty, and begged him to get out of it. Urick responded that they didn't even know him properly. They couldn't even imagine where he came from or who he truly was. Bachman knew he was very confident in everything, but it was time to learn the difference between being determined and being reckless. Then Urick replied that the people there were all a bunch of cowards. Now he shows up telling him to cancel the match when he hadn't even tried yet. Even so, Bachman said it wasn't even necessary to try. The result was obvious. You just had to look at the northern barbarians. They fought the Empire for 10 years and ended up losing. On the other hand, the southern barbarians surrendered after 1 year of battle, and now they were just a prosperous civilization. Those were the expected results from the beginning. At that, Urick asked if he was sure he would lose, and asked what he intended to do if he ended up winning. With that, Bachman replied he would follow everything Urick said without complaint. Urick commented that he would regret it. It wouldn't be easy for him, which only made Bachman even more irritated for being provoked. Hearing this, Donovan muttered that it was to be expected from a barbarian like him. In the end, Urick thought Donovan hadn't lied before, when he said he had taken part in the subjugation of the barbarians. But the protagonist knew very well what a 5-against-1 fight was. Urick knew he could end up losing his life along the way, but he didn't plan on dying now, not when he had come this far. Putting on his war paint, he was sure he could win. Thus, time passed and the day of the battle arrived. Horus didn't understand why everyone was acting that way. They were staring at Urick's back as Horus said it was time. That's when he noticed that Urick had several marks on his face. He looked almost frightening when seeing like that. They went to present the match to the Emperor. He himself said he couldn't understand the final battle. Many people would be disappointed if it ended up being boring. Then his men told him to just look forward to it. Win or lose, they could promise it would be a truly interesting battle. To that, he replied that he was quite eager to see it. Even if bluffing, they thought the result was pretty obvious. But his eyes didn't lie. He was good at betting on things like that. The people who saw Urick enter the arena were shocked. There was blood painted on his face like a tattoo. He looked like a real monster. In truth, Urick thought the day was actually beautiful that day. In the arena, the 5 opponents appeared and immediately laughed at him. They said their sentences would be reduced if they took Urick's life. Bachman grew worried because he could clearly see that all of them knew how to fight. It was obvious he had gotten himself into something he shouldn't have. Sen said that by the way they held their weapons, they were likely volunteer criminals, all doing it for a sentence reduction. They were probably all fighters. Nearby, Donovan laughed because now he was surely dead. All the men rushed at Urick, who just smiled. After all, they were just as bad as he had expected from the start. They didn't seem trained for group combat. All they had were numbers. They were only analyzing him. None of them actually intended to start the fight. Urick asked if none of the cowards were up for a fight. If they wouldn't come, then he'd make the first move and make it work. Right away, they all tensed up because Urick started approaching. They prepared to defend against the full force of his attacks. Even so, the protagonist was sure he could do it with his sword. He pierced through his first opponent, laughing because steel was really tough. The other four rushed to attack Urick at once, but he had no difficulty avoiding the strikes coming his way. He quickly took another one down by throwing a small axe into the opponent's neck. Then he went on to attack the next one while he was completely distracted. That sword he was using was incredible. Any other would have lost its edge or even had its blade bent. Watching it, Donovan couldn't believe it. It really was an imperial steel sword. Around them, others were surprised because it truly was one of those swords. To begin with, they didn't even know how it was possible for a barbarian to have such a thing. Donovan responded that if they tried to do what he did with their weapons, they would break. They couldn't even test it. He was just a barbarian, not immobile, yet he still had that sword. Meanwhile, Bachman celebrated because Urick had taken down two of them at once. Stud mentioned that his story would be different if they were trained soldiers, but they were just a bunch of senseless people. He overpowered them with sheer pressure. They were nearly dying from fear. Therefore, Urick could do whatever he wanted without worry. They laughed because that kid really knew how to fight multiple opponents even being so young. What he showed by proposing the fight wasn't arrogance but confidence. Urick took down another one shortly after. Only two were left now. Even though they knew how to use weapons, they were more like street thugs. He still thought it was obvious they were no match for him. After all, he was a true warrior and no one took him down that easily. But they could charge at him. It's not like they had another choice now. They still ran toward Urick, and he sighed. It didn't even feel worth getting excited about. What drag. And within seconds, the protagonist finished off the first one who came at him, followed by the second, thus taking down all 5 opponents. The other celebrated as he claimed victory. This was what they had been talking about. The protagonist smiled as the crowd cheered all around. Later, Urick left to clean the blood off and suddenly everyone stepped away. Urick saw that Donovan was approaching, commenting that he was now the main attraction. He stared at the protagonist and extended his hand to congratulate him. He had become the big star of Horus's Gladiator troupe. Time passed, and the protagonist dreamed of good times with his tribe, where everyone celebrated with fertile lands and how they would no longer go hungry. It didn't take long for Urick to wake up from the dream with someone calling his name. When he sat up abruptly, Bachman jumped back in surprise. He said the troop leader was calling for him. It was probably because of the previous battle to have a talk. Urick then got ready to go out and see what they wanted to say to him. Horus saw that he had arrived, and then said they had assigned 5 new matches. But one of them was against a champion. Donovan said they could just send a slave, and the protagonist didn't understand why they couldn't just defeat the champion. Donovan laughed, thinking it was funny he wanted to be a noble's champion. It was easier to send someone who wouldn't be missed if they lost their life. Horus said they had slave gladiators for matches like that. There were some battles they couldn't win anyway. Their matches would be during the first half, and Donovan agreed, because he would be participating in the battle against Aragon's gladiators. It was a 3-on-3 between 2 gladiator troops. Horus said he would like Urick and Donovan to fight together in the arena. The two stared at each other and immediately exchanged sarcastic looks and remarks. Still, it was just a suggestion from Horus. In that case, he sent Urick in his place. He could choose 2 people of his liking. It would be 1.5 million per person. Donovan asked for a moment, so shocked by what he had just heard. Actually, Horus had given him the match for the next day, so now it was Urick's turn to act. But he could let Donovan keep it if Urick refused. The protagonist had a suggestion. They could use a slave, and the other 2 would get 2 million instead of 1.5. Urick said he'd like to get the slave Sven to put in the battle. If he got him, Horus would give 1.8 million to each, and add 300,000 extra for him. Urick agreed. That way, it could be between Bachman and Sven, and the protagonist thought about it. Civilized people use letters instead of speech to record things. He noticed that when Horus wrote things down on paper, he could learn more if he learned to read and write. A little later, Urick went to ask Sven why he continued being a slave. He answered it was because Horus had given him a chance. The protagonist wanted to know if he was interested in the chance to go to the Hill of Swords. Sven replied that his soul could remain forever in the world of the living. He had nothing left to wish for except to die fighting. Then Urick asked about his homeland. Maybe he had family. After a long silence, Sven said he had lost everything. Both his home and his family. He seemed very downcast. After a war started against an empire, the clan planned to migrate east. He and the men had women and children for whom they were responsible. There was a legend that said there were lands beyond the sea to the east. Tales said their ancestors touched those lands and returned. They even said people with black eyes and hair lived there. Both Urick and Bachman were surprised that something like that existed. In the end, he became a castaway and turned into a slave. Urick laughed, even finding Sven's whole story pretty funny. Sven smiled with a sigh. They could laugh at him. It had been a foolish choice. Now his final wish was to die fighting and end up at the Hill of Swords. Then Bachman said there was just a cliff over the Eastern Sea. The end was just a cliff. He would have simply fallen off the edge of the world. After all, he was from the coast too, and had never heard anything about Eastern lands. Sven asked if he had forgotten that his people were superior in naval construction. The protagonist replied that he couldn't care less about world edges. To begin with, he didn't even think the sea was that big. You couldn't just swim to that so-called edge in a few days. The two shouted that it was big enough not to even be measurable. A little later, they realized their time to fight had finally come. The edge of the world was still on Urick's mind, and he wondered if something like that really existed beyond the ocean, and he didn't even know what was there until he saw it with his own eyes. The trio entered the arena. The world was vast. There were still things to see, and Urick didn't intend to die until he learned more about the world. Later, after the battle was won, the group went out to drink and celebrate. The noble welcomed Horus, commenting that the citizens loved his great gladiator. It was all thanks to the Count, but then everyone stopped at voice. Treos asked for a moment of their attention, for his champion was also very skilled, especially with axes, and he wanted to show off his abilities. He would certainly be even more pleased with his champion's skills, more than with a mere gladiator who had just gained attention. Then Treos called for Mogi, saying there was no way his gladiator could be worse. He should be able to do something any regular gladiator could. Mogi started stammering a reply. After all, he wasn't confident, but he knew that Urick was far more talented than he was. There was no way to win in this case, but Treos hoped he wouldn't embarrass him. Urick noticed they really had chosen to do a throwing test. Bachman said that if a noble gives an order, it must be obeyed. It didn't matter whether or not he could make it work. It would be a relief if the poor servant's head wasn't split in two. The two laughed because maybe he could make a better throw than Urick. But it was impossible. No one could be better than him. Anyway, Bachman asked how he could be so sure that Moby would mess it up. After all, Moby was also a champion, in fact. But even after throwing the axe, the man missed the apple. Everyone stared a bit shocked as Urick walked up and ate the apple. Treos had completely ruined his father's business, but still hadn't realized it. Someone like him would only cause damage. Nothing good came from associating with such a person. Horus watched this with a grimace. The young master was a pain. They could end up caught in the crossfire. Then he told Urick it would be better to head back first, though Urick was unsure. After all, he thought it might be pretty entertaining. But Horus pushed him out with Bachman, looking a bit nervous. Even if they stayed, it would be like feeding a satisfied lion. Still, Urick stayed to watch the arena from the stands. Bachman hadn't expected to see him that day to watch the fights. That was Donovan's match day, so there should be nothing for Urick to do there. Urick commented on the young noble who seemed so over the top. He couldn't believe he was discarding his champion just like that. Just because he missed an axe throw, he was being sent to the lions. Bachman replied that when it came to gladiators, you could buy as many as you wanted. His condition didn't look very good either. It seemed the noble got very angry and sent him away. From the way he was moving, his left arm must have been broken. His leg too. Bachman was surprised Urick could see that from there. It didn't take long before the fight with the lions came to an end, and Bachman noticed that the next match was Donovan's. He could be very cruel, but he fought by the rules. That way he never took unnecessary risks. He also knew his skills. He could slowly suffocate his enemies like a snake before taking their lives. Urick figured his business there was done. They could leave. Then Bachman asked if he didn't plan to watch Donovan's match. After all, the protagonist couldn't care less about that guy. Time passed, and they continued traveling along the road. Urick warned the troop leader that he was going to fall off the horse if he kept doing that. He replied that it was because it was really boring, to be honest. Then he asked more about Urick, wanting to know where he came from. Urick replied that he could only imagine he fell from the sky or something like that. Honestly, it wasn't any more important than that. That made Horus sigh because it really wasn't important at all. He had met countless gladiators in his 10 years managing the troop. It was hard to pinpoint anything specific, but Urick was special. He didn't think Urick was the kind of person who would live the rest of his life as a gladiator. The protagonist felt like he was being praised too much. Even if he was a barbarian who knew nothing of this world. That drew a laugh from his boss when he heard the way Urick referred to himself. Because that same barbarian was in the same position as Donovan. Even after just 3 months since joining the group, Urick confessed that he really liked that place, which made him laugh again because he couldn't believe he liked a place like that. It was because he wanted to have land in that place, and Urick was determined to fulfill that dream. Horus gave a sideways glance at the protagonist, who was smiling. He mentioned that if he earned enough money, maybe it could become possible. He was sure he could buy land in the countryside. Inside, he asked his sun god, Ru, it would be alright. If he kept the barbarian with him, he felt a bit worried. Urick asked where they were going now and when they would reach the sea. His chief replied that they were still far from the coastal city, and his plans were still the same as he mentioned last time. That's when the protagonist remembered that Horus could read and write too. If that was the case, he wanted to learn to write and needed help to write a letter. Horus mentioned that it wasn't the kind of thing one could learn in a single day, but that was exactly why Urick asked to be taught. When asked if he would do it for free, the protagonist smiled, offering that Horus could keep 10% more of his original payment. After a moment, Horus gave a small laugh at the proposal, saying to meet him after dinner. He would start by learning to write his own name. At night, the group of fighters gathered to eat around the campfire. They were curious why the protagonist was distancing himself from them, instead of joining in so they could have a men's round. Urick replied that he wasn't interested. He had no money for that right now, which made the men laugh as they'd heard he was learning the imperial language with the leader. He got irritated because they were mocking him, but the others just laughed at the joke. Urick went out for a walk during the night and turned around when he sensed a presence, but thought it must be nothing when he saw there really was no one there. He went to see the troop leader and asked the guards for permission. Horus asked if he really wanted to learn to read even if it wasn't necessary. However, Urick replied that it was his decision, not the leader's, to which Horus acknowledged that he really was a very special person. Anyway, he decided they would start immediately once Urick arrived. He'd be a lucky guy if he managed to memorize all the letters that night, as well as write his name, and Horus used the dirt to write with a stick. During practice, he asked if Urick had really never learned to read before. He denied it. After all, he wouldn't have asked for help to begin if he already knew. But Horus was surprised enough because he was learning very quickly, memorizing all the letters after writing just a few times. Urick learned to write his own name, and Horus was surprised again. This way, the protagonist was convinced he would memorize things quickly. It wouldn't be that hard to learn the language and writing of this other world. Horus felt that he really could do it because his memory was remarkable. He had heard that barbarians learn very quickly, but it was still impressive. Urick learned to write sword and spear, and Horus showed how to write axe. They spent some time there while the guards held their posts, until suddenly one of them was struck in the head by an arrow. Soon everyone shouted that it was an ambush as flaming arrows rained down. The warriors screamed for everyone to wake up and grab their shields, without knowing what kind of group had decided to attack a gladiator troop. It didn't take long for Urick and Horus to be found. The protagonist told Horus to hide first because he couldn't fight, but he was worried because gladiator troops were different from merchants. For them to attack like this, they couldn't be mere bandits who had found them. Urick couldn't see where those people were. They must have been using the darkness of the night to make a surprise attack. With all the light earlier, his eyes had adjusted to brightness, so he couldn't see far. He needed time for each eye to adapt. Without Horus, managing the gladiator troop would be a problem. Therefore, his safety should come first before anything else. But before he could yell for Horus to do something, he found him on the ground, struck by an arrow. He approached, telling him not to move, even though he had been hit directly. It had pierced his neck, so Urick couldn't do anything. Horus began to cry, so Urick shouted for him to focus only on him, explaining that he would die soon. He had very little time left, so he should pray to his own god in this moment. He shouldn't move so much and just prepare for death. People who believe in their god could find the chance to reincarnate. For now, he could relax because they would meet again in the other world. Urick calmed Horus as he slowly began to lose his life. He told him how he came from the other side of the mountain range, about how there were people like him on that other side too. And he, Urick of the Stone Axe tribe, swore to the heavens in his name that the people who attacked them would never see the sunrise again. Therefore, Horus could rest without worrying about revenge. Horus gave his final breath with a small smile on his face. After closing his eyes, Urick stood up, ready to fulfill his promise. Returning to the battlefield, Donovan was in disbelief at the mess there. He ordered everyone to stay focused if they didn't want to die, and told all of them to get ready and grab their weapons now. He also told Lullo, Paul, and Vjorn to act immediately, to grab 2 more and move to the right side, waiting only for his signal. They would disrupt their sightlines, also guiding Giggs and Nelsie with them. They still didn't know their enemies' numbers and were in a disadvantaged position. Retreating was also an option, but even so, they couldn't do that. There was no way they could just flee after such trouble had already happened. Donovan told Giggs to get ready to throw his spear. They would only advance in a movement once the arrows stopped. They probably weren't very numerous. If they had more people than them, they would have just drawn their swords, surrounded them, and started the fight. Then Donovan said Giggs could throw it right now. All the men charged toward the attackers, and thus a battle began. They weren't even bandits or mercenaries. Either way, they would defeat them. The leader of the attackers kept shouting for them to be killed. If they succeeded, he would pay double what was promised. That's when Donovan recognized Trios, who was leading the whole group, and asked if that fool was the one who set the ambush for them. It seemed he had suffered a humiliation, and it was their fault, truly troublesome. It would be great if they could take him as a hostage, but he was in the rear. It was even harder now because most of the cowards and slaves had fled. Their numbers were very small when compared to the enemy. Donovan thought he should have taken the chance to flee too. Suddenly, they heard shouting and realized Urick had arrived on the battlefield. He furiously attacked several men there at once. Backman was relieved. After all, he had taken so long it seemed like he had fled. That instantly made him want to laugh because they thought someone like him would run. Then they shouted to Urick to go after Trios, asking if he remembered him. The protagonist questioned how Donovan dared to give him orders, and suddenly threw an axe in his direction, causing Donovan to freeze. But instead of hitting him, the axe went straight past and struck the enemy behind him. Urick said he should look properly behind his back before trying to give orders. The battle continued, and many opponents fell by Urick's hand. It didn't take long for Urick to see the familiar face of Trios, who trembled. Soon, they captured the surviving men to keep as hostages. Trios cried for help and said he would pay for his own ransom. He was a noble and therefore had the right to pay for his well-being. Donovan said they should just take his money already. Since he had paid so much to have them killed, he would certainly pay more to live. Bachman agreed, even if it was for self-defense. It wasn't good for a gladiator troop to hold a noble hostage. Urick approached and said the gladiator troop was finished because Horus was dead, and he had sworn to avenge him. So he took Trio's life without hesitation. Bachman watched in shock because the protagonist had killed a noble without hesitating. The other men stammered, realizing they would all keep their mouths shut. In fact, they even offered to work for them, then begged for their lives as long as they could stay. Even so, the gladiators didn't care. The information couldn't spread, and they were all enemies. They wouldn't take it personally, but still took their lives anyway. They decided to gather the bodies and burn them to hide the evidence. Later, they prayed to the sun god Ru that his children would return to him. Urick remembered hearing that the people there believed in him. When they died, their souls would rise to the heavens to be purified. Then after that, they would be reborn in the arms of their god. He wondered if Horus would be reborn somewhere too. In the past, he told his dying brothers that they would meet again in the world of souls beyond the celestial ridge. But their souls weren't there, not anywhere, in truth. Rebirth through belief in the sun god, the hill of swords of the northern people. And for Urick, things were gradually changing. The group of men wondered what they should do now that Horus was dead. In that case, they could no longer continue as gladiators. One suggested they could just take the money and part ways. Bachman replied that many of them still hadn't earned enough money, especially since it wasn't enough to return home. Besides, there were wounded who couldn't do much on their own. The protagonist just listened in silence before speaking about mercenaries. The next day, they went to eat and pass the time. Urick complained because they had been waiting there for 4 days. His body was starting to shut down at this point after so long. Bachman replied that they should wait because no one would want to call them. They were just a small band of mercenaries with no name. The protagonist complained because none of this would work out. They hadn't earned any money. That Bachman had to agree with. Not one of the 21 heads could use their brain. So all the financial matters ended up becoming a mess. Losing Horus was the worst thing that could have happened to a group of men like them. Anyway, Urick asked if he was sure the information they got was accurate. They had spent a large amount of money to make this possible. If the information was wrong, he'd rip the neck off whoever tricked them. Count Degleton and Count Molando would soon start fighting over territory. The first battle would begin right there in that area with the military. It was the only place that would have a battle in open fields. They had also been sitting there for almost 4 full days. The others asked him to calm down a bit and think clearly. If this job didn't work out, 2 different things could happen. One was that a large portion of the men would leave the group, or Donovan would end up becoming the new team leader. The reason Donovan agreed to stay in the group was that he wanted to surpass him. He wanted to outsmart Urick and definitely become the new leader. That made the protagonist laugh, as if he thought he could pull something like that off. He was good at commanding people, maybe even better at it than that. Bachman asked if that wasn't the reason Urick ended up staying in the army. He would have had a much better life as an imperial soldier than as a gladiator. It didn't take long before they paused again to eat. While they were eating, suddenly someone came running with an alert. People had arrived there to talk peacefully during the meal. Urick told them all to stop eating and grab their gear. As soon as they were done there, he'd offer them plenty of food. When they climbed up to look from a distance, they saw soldiers in the forest. The army flag on the right was the red bear, and the army flag on the left was the golden trident. Count Degleton had the red bear flag, and Count Molando had the golden trident flag. There were 100 men on each side of both armies. Urick smiled. They could interfere whenever they wanted. Now he organized the group so they could go immediately and begin. Meanwhile, the Count's grandson was on the battlefield grumbling about Degleton for daring to come now and claim his grandfather's domain. The surrounding farms were lands managed by the Molandos for 2 generations, but on paper, those farmlands were territory of Count Degleton. They had a valid reason to claim it. They could assume the records of them purchasing those farmlands no longer existed. All they could do was leave that decision to Ru. The size of their states and populations was basically the same, and the current situation of Count Degleton shouldn't be different from theirs. If they were right, Ru would end up being on their side. Suddenly, a soldier shouted to warn that someone was approaching. The leader came forward to ask if the man was one of Count Degleton's envoys. He replied that he was an envoy from the mercenary group. They were positioning themselves in that area and ready to act. The leader asked who exactly was the leader of the mercenary group, and the envoy replied that it was a warrior named Urick. He had been one of the gladiators from Horus's troop in the past. The leader had never even heard of him and asked how many they were. He replied that there were 22 of them, all fully armed veterans, and with plenty of battle experience that he could guarantee. A soldier whispered to the leader that quality mercenaries were just shy of becoming a permanent army. 22 could make a difference on the battlefield. Then the leader questioned why he should trust a group like that to use mercenaries who had arrived even before the battle started. He replied that if the Count didn't want to use them, then they would work for Count Degleton. They were probably offering the same deal now on the other side. The leader pointed his sword at the envoy, finding it bold that he dared threaten him. That made him give a nervous laugh. He should have at least done that to ask for a bit more. But either way, it seemed the leader refused and decided to walk away. After a moment, the leader asked how much he wanted for the job. When the envoy returned and Urick asked how the negotiation went, the man replied that Count Molando offered 100 per person, half of the loot, and they would get first pick when the time came. Count Degelton offered 200 per person and also said he would pay more. That is, if they helped him properly and could collaborate. Bachman responded that the best offer was obviously Degelton's. They could just loot as much as they wanted, even if it wasn't offered as payment. It was foolish to think that looting everything would be better than getting paid to begin with. Degelton's base value was double that of Molando's. Urick agreed, since that way they could side with Count Degelton. Then Sten stepped in to speak against his proposal. In his opinion, they should go with Count Molando's offer. The protagonist asked why he believed such a thing. Sten explained that he didn't believe Degelton would really pay 200 to each. He could afford that much, but it was still too much for a count of a small territory to spend. He said he would consider paying more if they helped even further. Urick understood that he was arguing that Degelton wouldn't offer that much money, especially not to a nameless group of mercenaries who appeared out of nowhere. Then Donovan argued that Molando's offer seemed to be the more trustworthy. Sten agreed all he would spend was 2,200 in hard cash. Degelton would probably trick them by saying he'd pay it once it was over, or end up ordering their deaths once the battle was done. Sten had heard that Count Degelton was the one who started the battle in the first place. That meant he was the type of noble with great ambition. That convinced Urick, and he asked the others what they thought. In the end, everyone voted to fight on Molando's side. With that, it was practically decided which side they would take. If anyone had something to say, they should speak before he finished counting to 10. Since no one spoke, Urick decided it was showtime. While Molando stayed with the mercenaries, Degelton complained. That idea thought a few mercenaries could change everything. He would never have expected the captain of the mercenary troop to be his half-brother. In fact, even the others were surprised, because the captain of the Silver Lion mercenaries was someone connected to the troop leader. But it was thanks to that they managed to hire 20 heavily armed soldiers. Most of their force wasn't made up of soldiers, but of farmers. Even with the mercenaries that were just recently hired, it would be nothing compared to the 50 armed soldiers on their side. The Silver Lion mercenaries were all fairly well known in their own right. To think that his older brother, who had fled 10 years ago, would become the captain. The leader couldn't believe it either. He was just as shocked. Then one of the soldiers asked the lord to retreat, because arrows were coming their way and they should be careful. They noticed they had few archers, so it was better to advance quickly. And the leader told Alrian he would give those lands to him. This battle would be especially for him. Degelton had twice as many heavily armed soldiers as they did. They wondered what had happened. Things weren't supposed to be like this. They failed in the information war. If they hadn't hired mercenaries, Molando was sure they would have been defeated right away. But among the mercenaries, only a few were heavily armed. The others might have been veteran soldiers, but they weren't well equipped. Their numbers seemed similar, but they were at a disadvantage. Urick said they could take care of the right and left flanks. Now was the time to make money. Staten got very excited. It had been a while since they last fought. They could just charge forward and send him to the Hill of Swords. That made the protagonist see how Sven wasn't afraid of death. He was completely certain he would go to the Hill of Swords when he died. Donovan said to follow Sven's formation. The enemy's formation had been broken. The soldiers started falling to the mercenaries too. They couldn't believe they had to die because of a fight between lords. The enemy mercenaries were breaking their formation. The others noticed this and asked Alrian to order the heavy infantry, so they could advance in that direction and succeed. The battle continued, and soon Urick encountered the elite soldiers that had appeared. They kept praying to the sun god Ru to grant them victory. If they had Ru's blessing on their side, they might survive. Death approached Urick, but those guys in the battle didn't stop. Unless you slit their throats, they would never stop coming. When you encountered warriors like them, you had to make sure their lives were taken. The battle continues, and the protagonist promptly dodges the incoming attack. He comments that he almost died after that small axe flew past him. The soldier was shocked, not knowing how he could dodge the attack. Especially without looking, it seemed like he had eyes on the back of his head. Urick replies that his senses become weaker when wearing a helmet. Even if it's just wrong intuition, those senses were important to a warrior. Watching everything, the leader wonders how they could be under so much pressure. Arian responds that they had incredible warriors on their side. Their formation was beginning to fall apart. They couldn't retreat like this, but then they saw Urick running. The men shouted to stop him. They couldn't let him get close to the Count. However, Urick was far too fast for them to keep up. He soon spotted Count Degelton and ran in that direction. Since he had to capture him alive, he would knock him out with the hilt of his axe. But instead of the Count, it was Alrian who was struck directly. The Count shouted his name, but Alrian hoped he could survive because he loved him. Furious, Alrian decided he would take revenge no matter what happened. When he looked again, the Count had fled before Urick could reach him, and he shouted at the soldiers when their leader ran away despite their pleas. When the battlefield calmed, Urick just stood looking at the bodies there, and he wondered where their souls had gone. Maybe to the side of the sun god, who knows? Maybe it could be reborn. The end of death was still a mystery, but Urick couldn't help reflecting on it. Meanwhile, the Count was mourning the death of his beloved Aurian. He prayed to his god, asking if Aurian had returned to his side, and wondered when he might be reborn and join him again. He believed the world had no meaning without him by his side. When he heard someone enter, the Count shouted in anger, realizing someone else was there. It was his older brother Garcia who appeared, smiling. He thought it would be better to give up those farmland territories. Garcia argued it wasn't worth starting a bigger conflict than this. They could just send some people to negotiate a peace treaty. But the Count argued back if the battle wasn't over yet, he needed to avenge someone. Garcia asked who he wanted to avenge. Was it his beloved who died? That shocked the Count, who wanted to know how he could know that. His brother said their late father must have known about it too. No one said anything because he married and slept with a woman. Then the Count asked his older brother for some of his mercenaries. If it were the prestigious Iron Lion mercenaries, something might work. Garcia said that yes, he was the leader of the Iron Lion mercenaries. However, his subordinates weren't loyal to him unless they were paid for it. If his brother truly wanted revenge, he would have to pay for it. The Count replied that his brother should know that very well. But it wasn't worth hiring all the Silver Lion mercenaries for farmland, especially the one he had claimed, so he only sent 20 mercenaries, because that was the appropriate amount of force to invest. But for revenge, it wouldn't be a waste to hire all the Silver Lions, so the Count handed over a large sum of money to pay them all, to help with his revenge as leader of the Silver Lion mercenaries. Garcia replied that his brother's revenge would also be his own. Now he could take it from his payment and make it work. When they heard about this, the soldiers thought Count de Gelton must have gone mad. They heard that Silver Lion Garcia was Count de Gelton's half-brother. It was better if Count Molando reached an agreement and sold the lands now. At least that way they could preserve something. They had to make a decision, whether to fight or negotiate. If the fief got any smaller, the next Count Molando might lose his noble title. He had to prevent that no matter the cost. If they lost the battle, they would suffer a huge, unrecoverable blow. Even after 20 years, the war expenses, and the repairs could drive the Molando fief into bankruptcy. But Count de Gelton was also at risk with this, and being a man, Molando had no intention of running away like a coward. Urick ended up hearing that the battle apparently wasn't over yet. The Count smiled when he saw that he didn't run away after hearing the mercenary's name. Then, Urick asked Backman if they were really that powerful, which shocked the Count because he didn't even know the Silver Lions despite them being mercenaries. Urick didn't see a problem with that, really. He didn't think it was necessary to know them. And he asked if there was anyone there who had seen the Silver Lions with their own eyes. They were jumping to conclusions and getting scared. Backman says that even so, the Silver Lions were powerful mercenaries. In the mercenary world, there was no such thing as a fake reputation. Then, Urick asks the Count if he really intended to fight or would just let it pass. If they chose to fight, the Count asks if their group would also join them. Sten immediately agrees the hill was waiting for him. In that case, Backman agrees because he would follow Urick's decisions. Donovan didn't think it was a good idea to fight against the Silver Lions. They were basically a regular army of men. It really wasn't good at all, in his opinion. Those guys fought large-scale battles like they changed clothes. Even if their individual skills were similar, the difference between them became greater when the numbers increased. The protagonist laughs, asking if he wanted to be the only one to run. Donovan replies that if he didn't know when to retreat, he'd die without even knowing what hit him. As expected from a barbarian, Donovan thought he was a real fool. Backman reminds him that they had decided to follow the majority now, and that was it. At this point, Donovan couldn't do anything to stop them. They didn't even seem to have death on their minds in moments like these. Thus, it was decided that the whole group would take part. The area around where they were positioned was completely open. They could be at a disadvantage if they stayed there to defend. That's why they were preparing by building fences bit by bit. It was better to stretch out as many defensive battles as possible now. But with just that simple fortress, it actually seemed impossible. The situation was worse than they had thought. The acquisition of wood also didn't go well. Therefore, progress was slower than they had expected before. Urick approached to suggest a good idea to the soldiers now. They could just prepare and set up an ambush. Wait for the fight to begin, and then capture Count Degelton. The two soldiers yell at the protagonist for the stupid idea. There wasn't even space to create an ambush in such an open area to begin with. Yet still the protagonist doesn't understand anything. After all, there was a great place to do that right there, and he even points it out. One of them responds that there's no place there to make an ambush. His people grew up there, and even they were saying there was no way that could be done. But Urick grabs the soldier, now irritated, as he tries to convince him of the opposite. They show where there was a manure field and how they could make it work. It was shallow, but they could stay there if they piled dirt on their backs, and so they could lie down on their stomachs. The place was good enough. When the fighting began, they could run out of there and capture Degelton. The soldiers end up agreeing because Urick had a point. The Count agrees. There was a popular saying that it was better to roll in manure than to die. Urick says that to begin with, those who want to ambush with him could raise their hands since the Count will give an extra reward. Even irritated, the men ended up feeling tense with the idea. Sten agreed, but Bachman was worried about catching a disease and all that filth. Urick says they needed at least 5 people. It would be great if it were 7 or 8, actually, to be safe. Donovan ends up agreeing to join and calls Lalo, Vajor, and Giggs too. It might be disgusting, but it was a role of great importance, and he questions if they would really leave it only to the drafted soldiers. Simon ended up going after, hoping the pay would be really good for this. Suddenly, a soldier comes running to report the approaching enemy army. Now they had to prepare to begin Molando's defensive battle. They quickly alert that the archers were getting closer too. Bachman realizes those guys weren't messing around at all. Maybe they should have fled, just like Donovan said. Other men start praying to the god Ru so they wouldn't die. Thinking about it, Bachman even found it all a bit funny. They believe in the sun god, just like they did, and yet they were fighting each other. Ru must be a very biased god, actually. It doesn't take long for them to realize the men were arriving, but they prepare to fight with everything they had to make it all worthwhile. The soldiers shout to destroy everything in front and kill. It became such a bloodbath, it was funny to even call it a defense. Bachman realized they were in trouble. They were too exposed. The difference in quality between their soldiers was just too big. The mercenaries who weren't there with them were sorely missed. The best were still hiding, waiting to spring the ambush. At this rate, Bachman was sure that they would all end up dead. He mentally hoped that Urick would hurry up and capture the Count. Meanwhile, Donovan was ready to kill Urick if he suggested another plan like this. The protagonist just laughed and said that Count Degulton was on a horse. He had 8 heavily armed soldiers near him for protection. Donovan said everything would go wrong if they ended up running away. They would only have one chance to make this work and nothing more. Urick readied his bow and shot, hitting the Count's horse dead on. They were shocked, wondering where the attack had come from. It didn't take long for the horse to fall, along with its lord crashing down. Then Urick ordered all his men to start advancing. He charged toward Count Degulton with a grin, ready to take off his head. But Garcio dismounted, ready to take the front line of the battle. It was an interesting idea, thinking they were going to stay hidden in a place like that. Urick approached, commenting that he didn't even look that old, but already had white hair. He had heard there were some really talented mercenaries there. He figured it was them. The battle was nearly over. But if he surrendered, they could hire him for the Silver Lion mercenaries. Urick laughed when he heard those words. It was a tempting offer. But he didn't intend to work for people weaker than him. That made Garcio laugh because it really was a shame for a nameless mercenary. When they exchanged sword blows, Urick saw that he could at least read movements. Whether it worked or not, he had to keep up the offensive. It seemed he wanted to finish this before they surrounded his allies. He let his armor guard the side and aimed for the head. Then Garcio prepared himself with a regular sword. Urick wouldn't be able to beat him. He wouldn't be able to pierce his armor or even injure him. But then he noticed that one attack landed squarely. When Garcio looked and managed to break his ribs, and he quickly realized that Urick's sword was actually made of Imperial steel. For a mere mercenary to be using a sword made of Imperial steel, that only made him even more curious about who he really was. Urick replied that he definitely heard his bones breaking. It must be hurting a lot, but he was still standing. Garcio felt he could win if he just got a little more time. So he shouted at the Count not to look back and just run. If he was caught, everything would end instantly. Urick pointed out that the Count was fleeing and told them to chase after him. It didn't take long for the protagonist to get rid of his opponent and grab the Count. He was furious because Urick had killed Orion, but the protagonist couldn't care less, telling him to stay still if he wanted to live, and ordered him to tell everyone to stop fighting right now. Furious, the Count just kept cursing the protagonist nonstop. Even so, Urick kept holding him and telling him to speak already. When he saw the state things had come to, Garcio sheathed his sword. He realized he had no choice now but to do what was told. Instead, he pulled out a throwing knife, which made Urick curious. It didn't seem like a very decent plan to have right now. But unsurprisingly, Garcio threw the knife and hit his brother in the chest. The Count was shocked by the betrayal and asked how he could do that. Even so, Garcio said he should be taken to Count Molando. He even proposed a peace agreement immediately. Later, everyone gathered at the base after the battle was over. Urick told them that Count Degulton ended up dying, and that this guy, claiming to be his brother, wanted to be his successor. The other Count was shocked that the former Count Degulton had died, even after saying not to kill him, and Urick explained that it wasn't him. As soon as he captured him, that guy took the life of his own brother. The Count was stunned that Garcio of the Silver Lion had done such a thing. He could hardly believe that he committed fratricide right in front of all the soldiers. Garcio asked if he wanted to continue that battle right now. After all, he was always pressuring and questioning his decisions. Molando replied that Count Degulton still had a young son. He couldn't be the true successor considering that fact. Garcio didn't see a problem if he married his brother's wife. He could adopt his son and become both his stepfather and the new leader. Molando said that if he wanted to become the Count, he would have to hide that he killed his own brother. Maybe Garcio had planned this from the very beginning, actually. He said he would probably have to prevent unnecessary rumors from spreading, at least until his position was secure. But he intended to give up that conflict area to begin with. Garcio wanted to sign a document about it right away. He could forget his brother's mistakes, and they could start over as good neighbors. The people there weren't fighting for their family or brothers. Then Molando shook Garcio's hand, reaching an agreement. The former count died from falling off a horse. That was the story they would tell. He himself had heard rumors that he had always been bad at riding anyway. In the end, they betrayed their family for their own power and greed. Urick just saw this inside, finding it all rather dull. That's what war and politics seemed to mean there, apparently quite different. Then Garcio asked him to at least introduce himself. After all, they had a good fight back there and could at least greet each other. Urick responded by saying his name, but soon decided to leave. If he had been alone, he would have gone and taken that guy's head off. Garcio said that if he had the reputation of fighting on equal ground against mercenaries, there wouldn't be any shortage of work for him, being a barbarian. Urick turned, asking if he had planned to kill his brother from the start. If his goal was to protect Count Degelton, it would have been easier to keep him nearby. But instead, he let him run, as if he had given Urick the opportunity to catch him from the very beginning. Garcio smiled. After all, he was quite clever to begin with. If he didn't die in mercenary work, he'd still rise far. He replied that he couldn't understand something like that to begin with. Everyone had told Garcio that a bastard child would never become count. They said that was a sealed fate. It was truly foolish. But he came back there to overcome his fate as just a bastard child. Urick reflected that, just as he said, he couldn't understand his intentions. Becoming a count didn't seem important enough to kill his brother. The protagonist couldn't understand how one thing was connected to the other. Still, Urick told Garcio to remember his name in the future. If they met again, he would surely die by Urick's hand. The two parted ways, and Count Milando held a great celebration. He called for toasts and applause for the mercenaries who were the key to victory. Bachman mentioned that the Lord was very generous for offering them so much. Urick was surprised because doing something like that made someone a good lord. At least Count Milando didn't take more than necessary. Bachman spoke about how he fled when he was close to dying from inaction. That was the reason he ran away from home in the first place. Because of the 24 mercenaries who faced the Silver Lions without hesitation, the noble was terrified by their spirit. He let go of the reins and fell off his horse, and the mercenaries, whom had been lions with the leader, all turned into kittens when he died and just ran away. At the feast, everyone was celebrating Urick and his warriors. They especially celebrated their leader, the barbarian hero from a mysterious land, Urick, the honest mercenaries who defended Count Milando's lands. Later, Milando went to speak with the protagonist. Those bards would travel to other cities and spread their songs, all because they received a good amount thanks to that. Urick replied that it was a great act of generosity on his part, but the Count didn't think it was enough to properly reward him, so he asked if he had any wish for a stable life. When Urick looked confused, the Count decided to explain more calmly, because he could offer him a piece of land right there. He would even exempt him from any taxes for this generation, if he accepted. He could meet a woman, start a family, and live there. In exchange, he would only have to fight for the Count, which shocked Urick in disbelief. A piece of land there had been the dream he held onto for a long time. It was truly an incredible proposal. It felt like being struck by lightning. He asked about the other mercenaries, but the Count responded, after all, his lands weren't large enough to give to so many people. He could, at most, divide it with Urick and maybe 2 or 3 others. 4, perhaps. With that, Urick ended up needing to refuse the offer right away. In truth, he had never intended to accept it to begin with, and he apologized. The Count asked whether a safe and stable life shouldn't be the dream of a mercenary, and asked what could be the reason for refusing his proposal now. Urick simply wondered why the stars shine at night alongside the moon, and wondered why the shape of the moon always changes during the nights. This world was full of things he didn't yet understand, and that made him smile. Thus, Urick replies that at least for him, that was not a dream. The protagonist spends the night sleeping, dreaming of his time in the tribe, as well as the times when he was still a child in his homeland. Urick shouted to the mountain range that the old men of his tribe were all wrong. This was the world of the living, and one day he would return and tell them all about it. They probably wouldn't even believe him. They wouldn't even be able to imagine that something like this was real. A world that existed on the other side of the mountain range. And that's why Urick intended to make it work. But in the middle of his dream, he ended up seeing a scene of the place on fire. Suddenly, Urick woke up and grabbed the neck of the maid who had entered the room. He pulled away from the woman and let go when he realized what he had done, apologizing because he had really bad sleeping habits. In fact, when he looked to the side, he saw that everyone else was sleeping, and he shouted at the lazy ones to get up already. A little after eating, they could get back to work. Later, the group went out for a walk through the city, and Donovan complained. It seemed they wouldn't be able to camp again for a while, but Bachman said they could still find good job opportunities there. Urick asked what the name of that city was, and Bachman replied Halvarand. There was a lot of commercial activity happening there because of the good geographic location. He used to work as a hired hand for a merchant. That was before becoming a gladiator, so he had been there a few times before. From now on, they would have to focus on earning money every day. They'd need to even beg for money on the street if they had no work. In the streets, people were talking about Urick's brothers, those who stopped the Silver Mercenaries in the former Battle of the Counts. They really were few in number, and people gossiped about how that was even possible. It was a small group compared to a massive army of soldiers. Some men approached to boast to the civilians that they were from that group. The Silver Lion guys had been very hard to defeat. Their heads could have been chopped off if they had let their guard down for even a moment. Donovan told his men to shout in the streets on purpose like that. They needed people to know they were there so word would spread. Urick agreed and asked what they could do next after that. Bachman commented on how he always asked their opinion first. He could bet that it was because of that attitude that the mercenaries weren't hostile toward him. The protagonist replied that his brothers from his homeland weren't there. But here, his brothers were the people in the mercenary group. Donovan said they needed information and also a job. There were probably more jobs around that required mercenaries, and those who were going to stay there could keep polishing their weapons and armor, instead of going off to mess around with women or drink until they dropped like before. Bachman smiled. He intended to gather information in that case, while Donovan could be in charge of equipment maintenance. Sten said he had a place to visit and apologized as he would need to leave. Urick asked what was so important to him. He replied that there had to be a slave market in a city like that. The protagonist agreed but still didn't understand what he meant, hoping Sven wasn't thinking about becoming a slave again. He could go to the Hill of Swords while working as a mercenary too. Sten replied that if there was a slave market, people of his race would surely be there. He would like to buy at least one of them if his funds allowed it. All the men looked at each other and Urick decided he would go with him. He would leave the rest of the work with Bachman and Donovan while he was away. As they walked, the protagonist asked how old he was. After all, he couldn't guess because of the beard on his face. Sten sighed. He had no idea because he stopped counting after reaching adulthood. Urick grumbled because he was still the group's leader after all. But even so, Sven called him kid in a teasing way. And Sven laughed because after all, Urick really was just a youngster. It seemed the slave market they were at was quite large. As expected from a commercial city, that's what Sven had imagined they would see. Urick noticed that now that it was mentioned, he had been a slave too. Sten agreed. His body may have been a slave's, but not his spirit. His spirit had never ceased its path toward the Hill of Swords. Urick agreed and told him to keep an eye out for a decent person. Sten looked at a group of slaves in silence. He approached to speak with them and use the northern tongue, telling his brothers to choose. They could live the life of a slave, or follow him now toward the Hill of Swords. The slave replied that he would certainly walk toward the hill. After all, that was where his god awaited him, and he replied in the same language. Later, they had purchased one of the men and Urick asked if he would be joining the group. Sten replied that this guy had been destined to die and now had received a chance to go to the hill. There surely wouldn't be a more loyal warrior to the group than this one. Then, Urick told Sven that he would have done the same in his place. If it had been one of his brothers who was captured alive, he would have done the same. Even if blood needed to be spilled, he would have saved him from slavery. Then Sven warned him to be careful with his hot-headedness. He needed to learn to be patient every now and then, and Urick complained that he was pretty patient. All a person needed to do was know when it wasn't necessary to be patient. When they returned, Bachman said they had found a job, and it was a good one. It came directly from the local lord to hire them. It seemed he was hiring people to support the armed forces. They were the main unit during a bandit suppression operation. He only asked that they pay attention. This was a big city. It wasn't a small territory, it was a place with a very wealthy lord. If things went well, they could go home with a ridiculously high reward. They might be able to buy better gear with that money. And he asked how long Urick planned to keep using leather. He replied that it was really comfortable. Steel armor didn't suit him. Anyway, Bachman scheduled a meeting with the lord for the next day. Urick knew they hadn't gotten the job yet, but they could celebrate and drink until late. Life was short, and everyone should enjoy the night to the fullest. The next day, the group went to the castle, and Urick was impressed by how well built it was. It was really cool, actually. The civilization of the people there was impressive. It didn't take long for the lord to notice they had arrived on time for negotiations. Urick sat down and greeted the lord, even if not very politely. The lord commented on how they were the most talked about mercenaries recently. The protagonist said he visited because he heard there was a job for them. One of the men there responded that he certainly didn't have good manners. He shouldn't forget he was in front of a lord and just a mercenary. Then Urick replied to Count Havaron that he needed a new marshal. That one didn't have good manners and wasn't very polite. After Urick threw the apple on the floor, he provoked the marshal, saying that if he drew his sword now, he'd lose his hand. When the two prepared to fight, the count asked Sidon to stop it. Urick asked if he thought he lacked manners just because he ate an apple. Or maybe he had a problem with him for being friendly with the lord. He was the barbarian Urick. They even sang about it in songs. He knew the lord and had called him even knowing that from the start. Urick was right. Fulfilling imperial order as a barbarian was a show of strength. Donovan agreed with him mentally and understood it well. They'd have to let that rudeness slide if they wanted to get hired. The reasons the barbarians lost to the Empire were differences in strategy and equipment. In terms of physical ability, they were all far superior. The Empire in particular had the strongest weapons made with imperial steel. They had monopolized it, and because of that, they were able to win. In the mercenary world where people had similar gear, the physical prowess of a barbarian was bound to shine. It was the nobles who were desperate for help, not the group. Then the Count apologized for his Marshal Seaton's rudeness. Sigyn said they were all far too rude for his taste. The Count didn't need to hire mercenaries, but the Count told him to be quiet. If they could prevent the death of even one soldier by hiring the mercenaries, then there was no price he wouldn't be willing to pay to make it worthwhile. That's when Seton apologized for the words he let slip. Then the Count said the payment would be 80 million in total. If it made a difference, he was willing to pay up to 100 million altogether. He was sure it wasn't a bad payment at all for 28 men. Urick agreed, and thus decided they could begin preparations. When they left the meeting, they celebrated because they had gotten a good deal. 80 million to eradicate just a few bandits was surprising. Urick asked Bachman who that guy was that went to battle unarmed. Bachman replied that he was a sun cleric. There were some who marched with soldiers even so. Urick noticed that with the cleric, he wanted to call them a shaman, but he asked why someone would be following the army. Apparently, it was to bless them before a battle or for the funeral of the dead. If someone's spirit is not well guided to the side of Ru, they would have to wander the world of the living for a long time before going to the sun. The protagonist comments that he must know a lot in that case. But it was obvious because men of the clergy were all very studious. Bachman asks why he is curious, but Urick had already walked away. Then he approaches the cleric to talk, who gets startled, but he recognizes Urick as the captain of the mercenaries and says his name is Gottfall. The protagonist introduces himself too, though it wasn't really necessary. Gottfall greets him kindly, saying he would like to thank him for the faithful in the city. He seemed to be only in his early 20s, but even Seton was very respectful toward that cleric. Urick asks why he was so thankful to him. He replies that it was for fighting the bandits for the good people. The protagonist argues back, saying it was just a job they were paid to do. There was no need to thank them for that. Even so, Gottfall says not everyone risks their life while fighting. Urick asked Bachman if all clergy guys were as crazy as him, and Bachman covers his mouth with a nervous laugh, apologizing. It was the first time their captain had met the cleric. That's when Gottfall said it was actually all right. He knew that many people had customs different from his. While the other two talk to try to get along, the protagonist wonders why Gottfall is being so nice to him. Maybe all men of the clergy were like that for some reason. Then Bachman reminds him not to make the sun god angry. Those people had offered body and soul to God to be there now. Urick replies that he knew they were like the so-called shamans from his homeland. Even so, Bachman insists because he knew Urick didn't understand any of it properly. The two keep arguing now because Urick felt offended being called an idiot. Gottfall just watches the two with a smile until the announcement comes that they'll take a break. They would camp there that night, and the others were a bit surprised. He kept talking about the sea all the time and lied about how big it was. Despite that, they wanted to convince the protagonist that the sea was real. Later, someone asks who was the idiot that put the used gloves on top of the pot. Another replies that it was animal leather. They could eat it if they boiled it. The men shout at Urick to hang him upside down. They could have his meat for dinner since he always annoyed everyone so much. At that point, he was again near the man of the clergy, Gottfall, and he asks what he was holding in his hand. He replies that it was bread. That was supposed to be his dinner, but Urick took it to take a closer look. But when he bit into it, he was surprised because the bread was so hard it hurt. Gottfall explains that this was bread meant to be cut into smaller pieces. Then you melt it slowly with your own saliva to eat it. Just because you're hungry doesn't mean you can eat until you're full. It was a good practice to train your patience, even when eating. Urick sighs because that was a hard life. It didn't taste like anything. The cleric responds that when you eat a delicious meal, your body may be happy, but your soul would end up crying because it wasn't being properly nourished. The protagonist asks if the life of a man of the clergy was always like that, and he replies that their mission was to guide the souls of the faithful to Ru. They had been trained by the world and could not succumb to the world's carnal pleasures. A fallen soul couldn't be capable of guiding other souls like that. Urick asks if he happened to know how to read, and he replies yes, of course. Then he asks him to teach him how to write, showing how much he had learned. That surprises Gottfall because he had never heard of a barbarian who could write. He thought those letters they used were all quite amazing. They could leave things behind no matter the time or place, and words left behind were inherited without changes or lies. Gottfall reflects that the value of letters, even those not understood by civilized people, ended up being greatly recognized by a pagan barbarian. It must have taken quite a while for a barbarian to learn so much. To think he would meet someone with a desire to learn there moves Gottfall emotionally. That's why he asks Urick to meet him at the end of every meal. He would be happy to teach him. He wanted to believe it was Ru's will. Later, when the protagonist went to visit the cleric's hut, he noticed something. He found Donovan kneeling in front of the cleric for some reason. Gottfall asked Urick to come back later because they were in the middle of a confession. Confession was an act where people confessed their sins, so that they could purify their souls and find paradise in the afterlife. Urick didn't understand what kind of meaning something like that could have, but he left anyway shortly after crossing paths with someone, who told him never to bother Monk Gottfall so much. He returned to the hut a little later and seemed that being a man of the clergy offered an amazing position, and Gottfall replied that it was because everyone feared death. There was nothing more frightening than not walking the right path after dying. Urick replied that when they died, their souls were purified by the sun's fire. Then they could be reborn, but the people of the north believed they went to the Hill of Swords. The Hill of Swords was not a paradise as the people of the north claimed, according to Gottfall. Those who committed as many sins as possible could only go straight to hell. There was no salvation in a place like that. It was obvious. The god of the northern people was violent and arrogant and didn't truly love his people. But Ru could accept and loved all life, just like his long rays of sunlight. Urick replied that a god didn't need to love all of his people, something the cleric refuted, saying just like no father or mother fails to love their child, there was no god who didn't love his people. It was unreal. Then the protagonist said he had been transferred to the leader's team, but he still didn't understand why Ru kept watching the people he loved fight, putting them against each other like that and watching them lose their lives. He said Ru was a god with overflowing love, but questioned why they had to take up steel and make others bleed. That made the cleric respond that it was because of original sin, because the desires and sins of men destroy the eternal day of the past. Thus came the darkest night, but Urick interrupted, saying it was blasphemy. The clerics of that place were the shamans, and all shamans always lied. After all, the world of souls beyond the celestial mountain range never even existed to begin with. Gothel turned and said he wasn't lying. But Urick said it was fine. He didn't want to fight about it, and asked what he had been talking about with Donovan earlier. Confessions were not words directed to him, but to Ru. If they entered his ear once, they would never come out of his mouth. Urick thought that everyone squealed like pigs when suffering from so much pain, and wondered if that would make Gothel's mouth open and speak the things he heard. After all, pain made people go weak immediately. Gothel didn't know what he was thinking in that moment, but Urick said that this was a civilized society and repeated it. In any case, the cleric could teach him about society now. The two spent the night studying, and the cleric observed the protagonist. The speed with which he learned things was truly impressive. He had an exceptional memory worthy of being remembered. When the cleric asked who he had learned those things from, Urick replied that it was from Horus. He worked as an intermediary for Gladiator fights and knew how to write. He had learned everything from him to deepen his knowledge. Gothel asked what he did now, and Urick said that he died. It was on the night he was teaching writing as usual. He had the misfortune of taking an arrow directly to the neck. He died in front of him without even being able to leave a will to the group. Gothel felt sorry for their pain, but Urick saw no reason for that, because he had killed everyone who was there that night to get revenge. Surprised, Gothel asked if he was really from the south. He first thought he was from the north, but no matter how many times he looked at him, he didn't seem to be from there. Urick replied that he came from somewhere around. Suddenly, an arrow flew and Urick reached out his hand to protect the cleric. Everyone shouted that it was an ambush, and they should prepare immediately. Meanwhile, Urick told him to lower his head and hide behind him. He didn't want to see his new writing teacher die a second time, so the cleric hid and the protagonist drew his sword to begin the fight. But it didn't take long for Urick to notice that the people had run away. It seemed like it was just a quick attack. In truth, it was pretty annoying. It didn't take long for a soldier to shout that it was still too dangerous to be walking around like that. He only replies that the enemies were gone, all of them had fled. Looking at the tracks, there were at least 10 men in total who tried to attack. It was a small-scale ambush, to tell the truth. It was a small-scale ambush, and he wonders what the sentries were doing. This was a situation in which an ambush was easily predictable. Suddenly, a man shouts for Urick to hear what happened. The soldiers were so caught up in conversation that they didn't do their job as lookouts. The protagonist saw that Giggs had also died in the middle of the attack, and asked Vigorn what he saw who had neglected his duty. When they pointed out the men, Urick punched one square in the face. The others just watched as Urick kept beating the men to the end. It didn't take long for Seaton to come out asking what he was doing, and ordering him to let go of his men after beating them with his bare hands. Urick says that because of those guys' laziness, his brothers died. But Seaton just thinks he really was a bastard. If he laid another finger on his soldiers, his head would go flying, well before any other bandits could do that again. Backman approaches asking Urick to stop for now. The cleric paused to say a prayer to the fire and the people, because his son was returning to him and might have mercy on that poor sinful soul. Donovan mentions that at least they had a decent cleric to pray for Giggs. Now he wouldn't get lost in that world of the afterlife. Then he comments that he heard Urick fought the soldiers for the one who died, and thanks him because he did that in his place. Urick replies that there was no need to thank him. His mercenary group was called Urick's Brothers to begin with. Even if it had been Donovan who died, he would mourn and rage for him. The protagonist couldn't see souls with his eyes, and wonders if clerics and shamans could manage to see them. Urick goes to Gothel, who asks how his hand was doing. He replies that he could move it without any problems, so it seemed normal. He was truly grateful because Gothel protected him from the attack. Urick replies that it was no big deal after all. Everyone kept helping each other, and Gothel agrees. Compassion and love were teachings of Ru. In that case, it was someone who was far from compassion and love. The protagonist asks if he managed to properly guide his brother Giggs to the sun, and the cleric replies that he returned safely to Ru's side. Still, there was one thing Urick was curious to know. He didn't believe in the sun religion, nor in the god of the northern people. Their afterlife didn't truly exist anywhere. Instead, he asks where he would go after dying. Where had the souls of his ancestors and his brothers gone now? And above all, where would his own soul go after death? Gothel says that the only thing left for him would be to become a wicked spirit that wanders this world. He could forget his original self, which made Urick fall silent and reflect on that. That night, he had a nightmare about all of it, hearing the voices of his brothers coming to complain that their resting place had vanished. It was all Urick's fault because he discovered the world of the living. This was his sin. If he hadn't crossed the mountain range, the world beyond it would still be the world of souls. It was he who destroyed the peace of the souls, even when they were soon to go there. Urick woke up startled in the middle of the night after the nightmare. He had a terrible dream because he asked the cleric a stupid question. Wicked spirits made him reflect on that. So looking up to the sky, he hoped that day would come soon and not stay trapped in the middle of the night. The next day, Sten says that from that point onward, they would be in enemy territory. The mountains and forests hate outsiders. If they couldn't find the hideout before nightfall, then they would be attacked again during the night, and it could be dangerous. But they only had around 30 bandits, not a huge number. Urick says some of them were good at moving through the mountains. If they underestimated those people just because they were few, they were the ones who would be wiped out for being stupid. Segan sighs, hoping he'll stop saying things that lower morale. But the protagonist was talking about something very serious. Urick says that the day after the attack, he followed their trail in the morning. But after a certain point, there was nothing left to follow. He was a hunter. He had once tracked animals for 3 days straight. If he lost the trail, it meant they knew how to use the environment to their advantage. Seaton says they knew how to take advantage of the environment. It was obvious. But in the end, it must have been just a group of bandits. Since they had an overwhelming numerical advantage, they could just surround them from all sides and several things. Urick replies that it means there's a high chance of a barbarian or a hunter being mixed in with them. If they were just hungry farmers who left their lands and became bandits, they wouldn't have thought of attacking them last night. Donovan agrees they needed to know exactly where their hideout was before moving. If they prepare, there's a high chance they'd be picked off one by one. Urick decides he'll go out to find their hideout and asks if he could at least be given some soldiers. That surprises Seaton, who asks if he's really that confident, even after just saying he lost the trail they left behind. Urick replies that obviously he wasn't some kind of god of the hunt or anything like that. Even he couldn't follow tracks that had been erased. The bandits felt excited to attack them during the night, so they'd do the same again that night and enjoy it. When that happened, Urick planned to hunt all of them down to the end. The group remained in the same place as time passed. A soldier approached to talk to the protagonist in the meantime. With what happened the day before, everyone was afraid of the leader, and he asked if he thinks they would be ambushed again. Urick replies that the group must know the mountains very well, so they were confident that even if they failed, they wouldn't be caught. They would probably try again, and they would definitely do it. Then Urick says to call him by his name, and the soldier introduces himself as Jezba. Jezba says he was from the city of the Peacemakers, actually. The group decided to wait right there for the attack that would come later. If it happened there, they could easily spot the bandits' movements when they fled. Jezba says he had also been a hunter in the past. Urick mentions that they could keep talking in the meantime. But anyway, they didn't have anything important to do right now. That's when Jezza said that being a hunter wasn't worth the risk, especially because of the large amount of leather and fur coming from the north. And also the south, the profits had dropped even more than before. Urick asks what they meant by a large amount. As soon as the Empire's conquests stabilized, the barbarians started becoming civilized. Anyway, the more barbarians signed contracts with merchants, the more leather and fur started being distributed throughout the Empire. Urick could now understand better what he meant. Jezza says that when he lost his job, he heard they were recruiting for the Peacemakers. That was in Havaron. Several things happened and he ended up there. The soldiers in Havaron were treated very well, so they didn't even have to buy food or anything else, and his wife got pregnant with their third child too. Urick motioned for him to be quiet, which made him worry that enemies had appeared. The protagonist replies that he feels like every time someone starts talking about family, they all end up dying, at least that had been his experience with it. That made Jezza start to doubt he was the same person who beat up 2 people, especially with his bare hands, even though he had a lot of prejudice against Urick. After all, he was a barbarian, but now that they talked, it was all fine. It didn't take long until they noticed people appearing later on. They decided to get ready to throw some torches in their direction to see at night. Urick guides the others to get ready so they could fight. For bandits, they sure had a lot of stamina. If things kept going that way, it wouldn't end well as far as Urick could see. He guides the men to follow him slowly. He would break a few branches to show the path he was taking. Jezba mentions he was also confident in his ability to move through the mountains. But Urick was practically a beast. He was barely different from a wolf. Their stamina was almost the same as the warriors from the tribes. The civilized people there normally had less stamina. Now, Urick was sure that those guys weren't common bandits. No one else would be able to follow them except himself. He narrowly avoids an arrow shot and a man approaches, praising him for dodging the attack so well. But Urick could say the same about him. He had managed to detect he was being followed. The man comments that the back of his neck had been itching a bit. He had to kill him quickly. If anyone showed up, it would be an enemy, not an ally. Urick knew there was a chance the bandits' hideout was nearby. The two begin to fight, and the protagonist focuses on the snake tattoo. When he hit him, the man was shocked by his tremendous strength. Urick kept attacking him until he completely took the man down. He was actually a little stronger. Meanwhile, Urick was only worried about his hatchet with the dull blade. Later, the group gathered and Jezva said they had almost not made it in time. It didn't take long for them to find out he was a devotee of serpents. Apparently, he was a northern barbarian of serpents, according to his snake tattoo. They were northern pagans who took the lives of children. They weren't treated as mere heretics, but also as cultists. They were despicable people that everyone hated, even the northern folk. It didn't take long for them to see an arrow flying toward them as well, and Urick tells them to blow the horn. They needed to hold off the reinforcements until they finally arrived. But it didn't take long for some arrows to strike Jezwa in the back, and he fell. Urick sighs, just like he had said to Jezwa before. When someone talks about family before a fight, they end up dying. It didn't take long for Urick to be surrounded by several people there. There were at least 20 of them. Then, and ordered them to surround him immediately, because he could be very dangerous. If they went one by one, they'd all end up dying along the way. They had to surround Urick, which made him smile to hear. They were finally using their heads, even if they were snake-tattooed idiots. They had experienced movements. They were powerful warriors. He could still hear the voices of the dead trying to speak to him even now. The voices called him to come closer to the other side. There was no resting place left after death. They would only be able to wander this other world without trouble. Urick wonders if he was going insane at this point. He ran through the forest and then made a turn to circle back, thus attacking several of the men who were approaching. It didn't take long before he was hit from behind with arrows. He took down several soldiers right after and soon saw an opening in one of them from the side. The man was shocked because the reaction speed to defend himself was enormous. Despite that, Urick had some serious wounds from the arrows. He managed to avoid having his belly slashed, but still received a deep cut on his leg. Until then, Urick had been able to kill them one by one while escaping their encirclement. But now that he had lost his mobility, he wouldn't be able to hold out against so many. The men wondered what Urick would do if they attacked from all sides. Even so, they couldn't underestimate him. The guy was a monster. That made him wonder if he was afraid of dying now. But then he realized he had never feared death, not even a little. What he feared most was wandering eternally after losing his life. A wheat field with golden light, a land in flames, the vast ocean, the edge of the world. Those were all things Urick dreamed of. Later, when Bachman found Urick, he was collapsed. He came closer to check if he was at least still alive, and Urick fell on his back with a laugh, thinking he was going to die. After the whole group gathered, the soldiers organized the tribe's men. They didn't mean to kill him because he'd be executed in the town square. Bachman mentions that the subjugation of the bandits was a success. They had been staying in a cave not far from where they found Urick. That was incredible in their opinion, and they asked how many he killed alone. Urick replies that he just ended up getting lucky. If the subjugation force had arrived just a bit later, he probably would have died. But they still needed to remove the arrows from Urick's body. Bachman tells him to hold on because it would probably hurt a lot. Then, he'd offer something for Urick to drink because it would make him feel better. He asks what it was, and Goffel says it was wine made from grapes boiled with honey and cinnamon. It would help him recover after losing so much blood. It hardly tasted like alcohol because it was boiled. It was more like syrup. When he drank it, Urick noticed it was actually quite effective. He felt lighter. He ended up feeling sleepy a little before that. But it didn't take long for a new commotion to break out. They noticed that the serpents were hiding snakes in a jar. The snakes went after the soldiers, and they realized the hostages were controlling them. They were using whistling to do it, and they tried to shut their mouths to stop it. The men were worried about getting bitten, because they were all highly venomous snakes, and some came at Urick. Goffel immediately became concerned about him and his health. In the end, he was bitten in Urick's place to save him. The cleric asked for a bandage to be applied to his arm, and they quickly prepared to do it because otherwise the venom would spread. A little later, Urick woke up from all the noise they were making. The men told him the priest was bitten by a venomous snake to protect him. Urick wondered why the weakling would do such a thing for him. Furious, he got up, but Goffel replied that it was all right. After all, he wouldn't die from something like that. But they still knew he would need to amputate the arm to survive. Bachman said they should do it quickly before the venom spread even more. Urick asked if he wanted something to bite down on, and Goffel once again said he was fine. He just intended to keep praying and asked Rue for the courage to endure the pain. Urick reminded the cleric that it would hurt, but he kept praying. A strong man was a strong warrior. That was the truth about the humans he knew. But Goffel was not included in that group of humans. He wasn't a warrior, but a very powerful person. Urick remembered that he could end up dying because of this. So at the very least, he wanted to ask Goffel something first, and he asked why he let himself be bitten by the snake in his place. Goffel said he didn't intend it. It was just that he had to protect him. Just like when Urick blocked that arrow for him and saved his life. He must have moved without thinking much about the pain that would come later. Urick agreed that that happened and it was true. But if he had to give a reason, it was because Goffel had somewhere to go when he died. Rue would guide his soul after death, but Urick didn't have a place yet. If he could see souls, Urick thought Goffel's would be immaculate and shining, and he wondered if all clerics were like him. He said the cleric might not be a warrior, but he deserved more than just his respect. Then the group worked on his arm, and he passed out. Urick thought that if his god didn't take him, he would survive. He stepped away, and Bachman asked where he was trying to go. Urick replied that he needed to pee, but left to be alone for a while. He crouched down, saying that if Rue decided not to take Goffel, then he would give him a chance and believe in the cleric's sun god. Time passed, and the mercenary group returned to stay in the city. They were being called damned cultists who deserved it. Bachman mentioned that still, they were being treated very well. That place was a guest room inside the castle and quite fancy, and he asked Urick if he was still worried about the cleric. Urick replied that actually he wasn't, but Bachman disagreed. After all, he seemed really worried even if he stubbornly denied it. Urick warned that if he said something like that again, he'd smash his face, but he wondered if it really was the right thing to do. It's not like he could go back on the vow he made. If he believed in Rue, his soul would go to a place different from his ancestors and brothers, a place where he could meet them again afterward. Maybe, if Gavel died like this, things could be different. If he died, it would still be fine, because that way, Rue would be nothing more than a sham god who didn't even answer a simple request. They then decided to go out for a drink and relax. They got drinks for the great Urick, whom they quickly recognized. That was the first time Urick saw a banquet as fancy as that. The civilized people were like that. Survival and combat skills weren't the only things they had managed to develop. They were always looking for something greater than what they had now, and he wondered if one day he could become like them. It didn't take long before the room was drawn to Gavel. He appeared walking with the help of someone else after losing his arm. People approached the priest to ask if he was all right. Gavel replied that his fever had passed, so he was no longer in danger. That must truly be the protection of Rue. It meant that he still had much to do in this world before leaving. Gavel agrees, believing it is also the will of his god. Urick approaches him, commenting that his god hadn't taken him yet, which meant he still had something to do in the world of the living. Urick wonders if Rue heard his prayers that day. Then the priest mentions that he should be leaving now, to which the protagonist says they would leave as soon as their bodies recovered. So Gavel decides he would continue writing during that time. He only had his left hand, but it still worked. Then, to Gavel's shock, Urick says he wanted to be baptized. The protagonist wanted to be baptized by him and was ready for it. That makes the cleric smile. Now he was certain of his earlier impression. Rue hadn't taken him because he still had a mission to fulfill on Earth. Urick spent some time, but in the end was baptized. To the sun god, Rue was the sun itself. Still, he wonders if he really should have been baptized. He wonders if it was because of a vow, just because he made that kind of vow. But Urick wanted to be sure even now. Gavel offers his prayers during the protagonist's baptism, about how his son who had lost his way yearns to return to his arms, and with a loving heart he prays that Rue guides that man. Urick needed an afterlife, and even his fellow mercenaries were there. He prayed that his soul wouldn't wander around after death, and they concluded with a prayer that Rue be the guide of his soul. Those were Gavel's words only for Urick. He was a valiant warrior, perhaps capable of carving his name into history, but he should remember to love others and show compassion. That way, his soul would become even stronger than before. Urick smiled. That was a difficult request coming from the cleric. It didn't take long before the protagonist heard about the sea. They had departed from the city of Ankora at the base of the Celestial Range and came to the eastern coast, and they pointed for Urick to see. The coastal city on the eastern border of the continent was the kingdom of Forcana. It had been a long time since Sven had truly seen the sea. Bachman heard that northern people usually built their cities near the coast. The protagonist was surprised because that thing was really the sea. It truly had an infinite amount of water, perfectly flat like a plane. Then Bachman tells country boy Urick to get off the rock already. They were going down because saltwater fish was really tasty. They would roast some so he could taste and eat it. Now, Urick was always wearing the necklace with the symbol of Rue, the sun god. He had become a follower of the sun. There was no need to worry anymore. Bachman was relieved because their leader was no longer a pagan. On the way, Urick asks if they weren't afraid to build a city there. After all, the city could sink from a sea flood when it rained. The men laughed, saying that would only happen if there was a tsunami, because there's storms, but the city wouldn't sink just from a sea flood. During the pause, the protagonist smelled the sea. It was the first time he had ever smelled that scent, something his brothers had never experienced. The group continued their journey to a fortress, where Urick went ahead to negotiate. They said they were mercenaries and were there looking for work. Karakin was a coastal city. It didn't have much work for mercenaries. Entry to the city was limited to 10 people at a time as well. They could camp outside near the wall. They would be watched, so they shouldn't even think of doing anything wrong. Bachman sighed. They didn't have a choice now. Urick said he really wanted to see the sea, but for others, it was also their first time. The envoy was confused about what was wrong with that group. He asked what the name of their mercenary band was. At least they could put it on the list, and Urick asked to write it himself. When he wrote that they were Urick's brothers, the man was surprised. He had heard a song from a bard about them just like that. The whole group celebrated when they realized they had been recognized. Since they were a known group, they could let all of them through. Urick was happy because his luck had been good since his baptism. He thought that believing in a god might really be a good thing. Now he could see the sea from the city, a land full of water that existed. That was an image worth more than 1,000 words. Urick shouted joyfully while the others were startled by his craziness. He felt the sea breeze and its scent, then went off to approach the water. Then Urick tasted the water, spitting it out due to the horrid taste. Suddenly, a person appeared commenting that one shouldn't drink seawater, and they asked where he was from. Judging by his clothes, he must be from far away. Urick told them to shut up, almost picking a fight on the spot. The person got irritated because it seemed they didn't know who he really was. They should have measured their words because they were someone of high status. but Urick didn't care and grabbed them to drown in the sea. The person screamed to be let go, as if they didn't even know who they thought they were. But he threw them into the water anyway, since no one walked away alive after saying such things to him. At that moment, the person drew a sword, and Urick laughed at the sight, because he would show what a real sword was like. It was different from his own sword. He could tell it had seen blood. He might end up back in Rue's arms if this kept up. Suddenly, a man appeared and approached, asking what he was doing. Urick defended himself from the man's attack, asking if he was the guardian of that child. He should be doing a better job than that. The man became furious that some random guy had shown up doing this. Then, Urick immediately exchanged sword strikes with the man. If he were his old self, he would have killed those two and left right away. Urick pushed the man back and knocked him down, saying that if the captain hadn't told him not to cause trouble, they would all be dead by now after all that. This enraged the man on the ground, who was ready to deliver divine punishment to Urick, because he had laid hands on that person without permission. Ignoring everyone, the protagonist simply walked away and returned to his group. He asked what they'd have for dinner, and they told Urick there'd be work before that. Urick was surprised, then entered the cabin to attend the meeting. That's when he met again the man he had defeated earlier on the beach. Urick laughed at his shock and introduced himself as the leader of Urick's brothers. They could just forget what happened earlier and focus on the job. The man was furious for having to endure such an insult, and suggested they could start by introducing themselves instead. Urick said he was free to leave if he didn't like him. After a moment, the man introduced himself as Cuba Fillion, but they could just call him Mr. Fillion in this case. The others laughed at him for calling himself Mr. when he clearly looked like an uncle. Fillion got irritated. If there were songs about those mercenary guys, their skills had been proven, so he couldn't miss this opportunity. So he asked them to escort the person he served to Hamel, the capital of the empire. Bachman replied that they didn't have horses, so it would have to be on foot, and it would take about 3 months of travel. Fillion said there was no need for horses. They would hide within their group of mercenaries and move naturally without anyone noticing. Urick said that even if it was an escort mission, it wouldn't be cheap, and asked if they could at least pay them in advance. He replied that not only could he pay, but he could exceed it. When Donovan approached, he questioned if he was mocking them. It was a small pouch of gold that couldn't pay even 1 month of their work. But when he looked closer, it was actually filled with pearls, not gold. Urick asked what pearls were and if they were valuable. Bachman mentioned he should be careful with them. Each one was worth at least 10 million in money. They were the jewels of the sea. Even for an escort mission to the capital, he had brought a pouch full of pearls. Urick said they would be back soon to discuss some things, and they left the cabin. Fillion asked them not to forget, the most important thing for mercenaries was sincerity. Outside, Donovan said this was a high-level job. This wouldn't be a regular job like the ones they'd done before. The pearls he brought were worth millions. With that job, they could earn an insane amount of money. Urick asked if that wasn't supposed to be good, not understanding why they were so scared. Bachman explained that the bigger the reward, the greater the risks. He should have paid attention to what Fillion said at the end about emphasizing sincerity. Stan added that it meant the job had to be completely discreet. Maybe it was a good idea to avoid the job they were called for. If it involved many high-status people, it could be dangerous. The protagonist asked Donovan what he thought about all of it, and he replied that he never wanted to admit anything like this, but Urick was speaking the truth. Going forward with your life on the line was what gladiators and mercenaries did. He asked the others if they intended to live their whole lives earning scraps. He didn't understand how they could be so scared at the moment that really mattered. Donovan insists that Bachman say something, startling him. The two argue because Bachman never wanted to take responsibility, and he always used to hide behind other people. Bachman retorts that it was Donovan who ended up being replaced and couldn't judge him like that. Then Sven approaches Urick to talk. He could just give the order and Sven would do things that couldn't even be spoken aloud there. So the protagonist approaches the arguing pair and separates them. They could proceed according to their tradition. Then they call everyone together so they could vote by majority decision. Later, they met again with Fillion, thus agreeing to his proposal. He says that the person they would protect was the young master Fahel. He was the third son of House Elprisha. House Elprisha had accumulated its wealth through pearl craftsmen, but Urick cuts him off, saying he wouldn't remember any of that. They were just names that meant nothing. He should simply state the reason for the escort. They didn't intend to betray his trust as was expected. If they decided they weren't capable of taking on this job now, then they would just leave without saying anything to anyone about what they heard. He could swear in the name of Rue, and Fillion saw that Urick was baptized in the church. He was a believer in the sun, not a pagan barbarian. So Fillion explains that Master Fahel was being pursued due to the inheritance division. The deceased lord left most of his wealth as inheritance to Fahel, despite being the third son, and that displeased the other young masters. Given that, he was sure Fahel would be willing to lend his strength there. But Urick complains that it was all too complicated for his head. To sum up, Fahel was being chased by his half-brothers because of the inheritance, and Fillion planned to ask for help from Fahel's maternal uncle, who was one of the members of the Imperial Steel Knights in the capital. Bachman realizes that in the end, it was a dispute about money. Nobles really were all the same. They didn't care if the people below them we're dying or not, and Urick just tells him to shut up for good. Filion continues, saying that at first leaving the Forcana Kingdom by boat was the plan, but the boat didn't arrive or they couldn't get in contact with them anymore. Something must have happened along the way, whatever that was. And while they were waiting for the boat, he ended up hearing about the mercenary group. They had arrived there, so he thought it might be better to go by land. Urick asks about the reward, and Filion says it was 3 times more than the advance payment. He would pay that amount after 3 months of service, and also 1 extra pouch of pearls for each month beyond the 3rd. After a moment of silence, Filion insists. He would also include payment for the risks they'd be taking. For each battle that happened, he would add his sack of pearls. Urick stands up and says he could make those payments immediately after the battles, which makes Filion nervous because he didn't have that much on hand right now. Then the protagonist says he wants him to make a vow in the name of Ru, and if he breaks that vow, he will become a ghost wandering for eternity. Sincerity doesn't apply only to mercenaries, it applies to employers too. So Filion holds Urick's pendant and makes the vow in the name of Ru. Thus, the protagonist agrees and asks him to bring the young master there before lunch. That night, Filion sighs because he finally found people to escort Yahello. He was quite relieved as he made his way back. The next day, Bachman was surprised when he saw Urick. He thought he had left earlier to go to the fishing boat, but suddenly he showed up there looking really downcast for some reason. When asked what happened, Urick mutters that the sea was big. Then he said he had taken a boat to try to reach the edge of the world. The boatman responded that there was no way to get there with that canoe, just laughing at Urick as they made their way through the water. The protagonist pouted because the guy had the nerve to laugh in his face. The others start laughing too, right as they hear shouting. Someone questions whether Filion had gone insane or something, heading to the imperial capital with those filthy mercenaries. Filion apologizes to young master Yahello after seeing him so furious. The ship they had prepared still hadn't arrived for them to travel. If information about them ended up spreading, it would become very difficult to leave by sea as planned. If they went by land, which was something they didn't expect, it would be safer. Yahello angrily questions what he meant by going by land. Apparently, they would need to walk for a long time, and that didn't please him. Urick asks what they were doing, not understanding anything, and Bachman says they should just try to let it go. He was a young master of a noble house who lived in a different world from theirs. The protagonist complains that the kid wouldn't last even a single day, especially if they threw him alone into the forest like that. Bachman agrees because he would cry and call for his mother, begging to be saved if they threw him alone into the forest. After laughing at the young master, Yahello went to inspect the horse he would ride. He complains because it wasn't white and its mane was all messy. Filion asked the mercenary leader to hurry so they could leave. Bachman then mentions that one of the city guards was coming. The guard asks if the mercenary group was leaving now, because the number of people with them doesn't match the initial record. When they entered, there were 46. Now there were more than 50. Urick replies that some rookies joined the group in the city and asks if there was any problem with that. The guard says it might be a concern, but he would like to check everyone's identity. Filion whispers to Urick that they couldn't let that happen, and Urick replies to the guard that something like that could be problematic. There were many mercenaries with suspicious identities, and they were all like that. Filion gets worried because something like this might not be possible. Urick says that if they really wanted to force them, he would end up using force. After a moment, the guard ends up agreeing with them, wishing them a good trip before walking away. Even so, Bachman knew that Guy intended to follow them, and Urick agrees it was obvious they would prepare a pursuit team. All because he got angry about having his demand denied. In that case, they could no longer go by the roads. They would need to go through forests and mountains to stay off the radar. Upon hearing this, Yahello asks why they were changing the route. They were mercenaries who fought because they were paid to. Maybe they could just kill the pursuit team. Later, during the journey, Donovan approached Filion, saying that if he didn't teach his young master to shut up properly, he was worried that one of the mercenaries might end up paying a nightly visit, and then they would end up tearing out his tongue for his insolence. Filion is shocked by Donovan's boldness, but he replies that wasn't it, he was just warning him out of concern. Just like someone who had been a soldier, he had a leader who talked too much. Filion was surprised to hear that he had been a soldier in the past. Donovan says he was an imperial soldier but was dishonorably discharged. That piqued Filion's curiosity and he asked what happened. He says he killed the leader who talked too much with his own hands. Filion thinks that mercenaries really were all damned. They were people with not even a bit of manners. The journey continues and Urick tells Yahello it was time to leave the horse behind. He asks if he really had to walk on a mountainous path, and tells Filion to order them to find another route. Then Urick says that if the pursuit team comes after them, it will be on horseback. They would need to walk a path that horses can't pass to be safe. Yahello was in disbelief that he would have to walk at the same level as those mercenaries. Watching from a distance, the mercenaries comment that Filion had incredible loyalty. If it were them, they would have left long ago. Then, Urick asks Bachman if by chance he liked horse meat. That night, they got rid of the horse and decided to eat its meat, leaving Yahello aside and relieved because it was finally quiet again. Filion says that his young master almost got hurt with what they did. Urick asks what he planned to do if something like that happened again. Faced with the threat, Filion only asks that they be more careful next time. Time passes and they continue their journey, with Filion helping Yahello. He helps so that he can at least endure a bit more walking. Urick mentions that if someone saw him now, they'd think he had been attacked. He was a crybaby who complained about everything. Fahal yells furiously that he wasn't a savage like any of them there. He was a noble, not someone who should walk at the same level as them. Filion asks him to calm down a bit. Urick sighs, then sits down saying they would camp there for the day. Meanwhile, he just listens to Fahal whining that he wanted a horse. He knew that noble was a complete weakling. Being loyal to a weakling like that wasn't even worth it, really. He asks if it would be good enough to risk his own life. Gavel, unlike the young master, had something in him that at least deserved respect. Urick wonders how value was given to people in the civilized world. Maybe it was by money, or perhaps by status. This place was very different from his original tribe. The protagonist approaches Fahel and asks if he knew how to read. The boy was surprised to see him holding a book, not knowing how a barbarian had gotten that when they were all very expensive. Urick asks why he's so surprised. He could read just fine. That makes Fahel boast that he finished that book when he was 7 years old. Urick says he could teach him some parts he still didn't understand. He couldn't study on his own, and Fahel asks what the idea was there. What could he even do after a barbarian like him learned to read? The protagonist shows that he was also a believer of the sun. He needed to know how to read to better understand the teachings of Ru, and even acts dramatic to provoke Fahel, praying to Ru because he wanted to learn more. But his brothers didn't help him learn his teachings. After that embarrassment, where all the mercenaries laughed, Fahel agrees to help and asks which part he didn't understand. He helps Urick read, and is surprised because he could learn quickly. Just by showing it once, he could remember more than half of it. He shows the word world, and Urick asks about the edge of the world. Fahel says it was the cliff at the end of the sea, the place where the water fell like a waterfall, so the sea wouldn't overflow. It was probably the first time Urick had ever seen the sea. He never thought he'd see someone drinking that salty water. The world was a flattened rectangle, and in the center was the continent they lived on. To the west was the celestial mountain range, and to the eastern sea, the edge of the world. But some people just called it the end of the world anyway. The protagonist comments that people from the north said something different. There was another land at the end of the eastern sea, and not this so-called end of the world. They said that in the land to the east, there were people with black eyes and hair. Fahel replies that this was a lie from barbarians who had never been to the other side. Urick asks if anyone had actually seen the end of the world. After all, they'd have to go and come back to say such a thing existed. The young master replies that there were no records of any of that. People in the past who went there nearly fell off, came back, and wrote about it. The protagonist believes they were just saying things they had never seen themselves. Then he asks what was beyond the eastern mountain range. Fahel replies that beyond it was just an endless cliff. No one could go there, and Urick laughs, asking if he was really sure. Fahel was convinced because he had read several books. Everything about this world was written in the books. There was nothing he didn't know, and Urick laughs, saying it was a good conversation. Now he was sure, thanks to Fahel, that he wanted to learn more about this world. But for that, it would be necessary to see it with his own eyes. Because books weren't completely true and could lie. That makes Fahel irritated because he might be belittling him. In the end, a barbarian was still just a barbarian. There was no reason for Fahel to teach any of them anything. So Urick stands up, suggesting that the young master could go to sleep now. The next day, he could ask more about the imperial capital. And he asks if he had at least been there before. And he agrees. Hamel wasn't just the capital of the empire. It was the capital of the center of the civilized world. Every road led to Hamel. Meanwhile, Sven tells Urick he had always been curious about where he came from. His words and actions never aligned with the people from the north, much less with those who came from the south. The protagonist says that if he wanted to say something, he should just say it already. When Sven was about to say it out loud, Urick gestures for him to stay quiet. But it was clear that he was actually from the west, unknown lands that were still untouched by the empire, a place whose very existence was still very uncertain. He was a barbarian from the west, and Sven smiled as he realized that. He was a complete stranger in those lands in the most literal sense of the word, the one who crossed the celestial mountain range. This was Urick. Time passes, and during the journey, Urick helped Fahel along the way, telling him to hang in there a little longer and stop being such a weakling. Filion comments that things would get easier after they crossed the kingdom's border. Urick saw that Fahel might be a young master, but he still had courage. He could complain, but he always did what was necessary to keep going. It didn't take long for the protagonist to decide they could rest a bit there, and Filion observed that this was why Urick could leave the mercenaries. He led by example and was never condescending, and he didn't abuse his privileges as a leader either. Instead, it was Urick who helped the others, so it was impossible not to respect him. Urick called for Donovan, telling the group to get ready, because the pursuit group had arrived and the battle was about to begin. Everyone got up, and Donovan ordered the men to wake up because the enemy had come. No matter where Filion looked, it was still a monstrous sight. Backman says this happened very quickly. They should have taken at least 2 more days to gather everyone. And Donovan agrees it was strange they had been caught so soon. Sven asks what Urick thought about it. It was a group gathered by the city's captain. If it had been them, they couldn't have reached the mercenary group so quickly. It was odd they had been caught even while marching at high speed. Urick agrees they had been moving at a fast pace too. which meant that Filion and Fahel had been pursued, and that had started long before they arrived in the city they had come from. But if Filion knew that, he should have told the mercenary group. It was possible he didn't know they were being watched so closely. Urick analyzed the situation and saw there were about 20 of them. The mercenary group had over 50 in comparison. The protagonist warns them to prepare because these weren't foolish enemies. They were attacking because they were certainly confident of victory. They knew very well that numbers didn't always beat skill. Bachman shouts to alert that they were entering range and should shoot. As they shot arrows, Urick saw how they dodged with great skill. Those soldiers all had clever tricks. They wouldn't die to mere arrows. Donovan says they should keep shooting to stop their advance. They had to surround them first and then get into the best possible position. Urick tells Bachman to protect the young master. Sven would go to the left and Donovan to the right. He'd take the center. Then, Urick leads the attack against the pursuers. The battle begins wildly and the protagonist starts to reflect. It could be their end if he simply broke their shields. But then he realized they were in pairs and very well prepared. While the front blocked with a shield, the spearmen took the chance to strike. It was great synergy as if they were one single person. Urick says to take the wounded to the rear right away. They were highly trained soldiers. It wasn't their first or even second time doing this. Donovan says they were soldiers trained in the porcupine formation. If they kept fighting without thinking, they'd lose badly to strategy. In that short time, they had hidden their whole bodies behind their shields. If Urick went into the middle of them, he'd just take a hit and die. Donovan asks what the others were doing hiding back there. They all needed help in the battle, and they just stood still. A group of men were sitting, and one of them threw a knife to point at one of them. The man stood up when he realized he'd been chosen. A body that would have met its end in slavery. It was an honor to fight again. When Urick saw the man ran straight toward the soldiers. The other soldiers were shocked by what he suddenly did. But the mercenary had broken the formation to give the others a chance to strike. As a consequence, the mercenary died, but he wanted to go to the Hill of Swords. Urick just watched this in shock and stun approached, saying this was the path taken by the men of the north. The battle continued, and the protagonist remembered Godful's words about how the god of the northern people was violent and arrogant with his followers. Now Urick thought he understood what that meant. The northern men weren't just big and strong in the physical sense, because the god of war was backing them, and that was Olgaro. Later, the battle ended and Urick ordered the bodies on the ground to be gathered. A soldier calls them idiots and asks if they even knew who they were escorting. The protagonist had no idea what that man was talking about. But if he told what he knew, he might be allowed to live, and the soldier started to speak about the young master. Or tried to, but an arrow was fired from afar and finished the soldier. It was Filion, and Urick asks why he killed that man. Filion says he thought Urick was under attack, but it was obvious to the protagonist that he just silenced him on the spot, and he orders that everyone from the young master's group be captured and put on their knees. Filion is surprised and asks what he was doing. Even after swearing sincerity in the name of Ru, they still did this. Urick responds that they were the first ones who weren't sincere, but Filion retorts, saying there must certainly be some misunderstanding. At the very least, he asks that they listen to his words first. Urick says he deceived his brothers and him, but he should say everything they did. Otherwise, they would finish them off immediately. When Filion plays dumb, Fahel cries for help when he is grabbed. Donovan tells Filion to speak up already. Otherwise, they tear out his young master's tongue very soon. Filion begins to beg them to stop hesitating to speak. Then he says that he is Varka and Forcana, the sole heir to the kingdom of Forcana. Fahel yells that they're all insolent for not kneeling before him. Urick kicks him in the stomach, telling him to shut up right now, because he was talking to Filion, not him. And he tells Filion to continue, but Donovan says they should just kill them already. This job involved the royal family. They should just kill them all and cross the border before things got complicated. Filion stammers that a huge reward would be waiting for them at the end of the mission. They would be helping the future king after all. But Urick saw no value in that because they had already been deceived once. He was just the king of a small neighboring country, not even proper royalty. First, he would have to pay the price for deceiving them. Filion remains on his knees begging Urick to take the prince to the capital. Urick replies that at this rate, he and his brothers would end up getting violent, since they were the ones who broke the principle of good faith. They might end up trying to kill them and steal their pearls now. If Filion really wanted to keep his young master safe, then he should pay the price that would satisfy his brothers. Seeing the way Urick was giving the information, Filion knew he didn't want to abandon the mission. Filion replies that he'd do anything as long as they take the prince. Even so, he doesn't understand the reason for revealing the lie to the others. Urick couldn't understand how he could go so far to protect such an immature boy, and Filion says that he was royalty and heir of his kingdom. That was more than enough for him to swear his full loyalty. The protagonist sighs because from his point of view, he was just an idiot. Then he asked Bachman how many of their men had died. He replies that 3 of them had 4 if they count one more now. Filion was right-handed and answered when Urick asked about that. It didn't take long before Filion offered his right hand to Urick, and the prince saw all the blood that appeared, but he could do nothing. Urick asked Bachman how many were wounded, the ones who bled heavily. Since there were 5, the protagonist says he should bleed more than his brothers. Then he pours it onto his back, warning him to stop the bleeding. At least if he didn't want to die, but he thought that was enough to settle the score. Even after all of this, Filion kept begging them to escort the prince. The prince stammered that they didn't need to be escorted by people like them. They could go alone, he just needed Filion to accompany him. Instead, Filion apologizes for such insolence to the prince. And to his surprise, he slapped Varka across the face, who questioned why. But he hit him again using the hand that Urick had injured. Filion shouted for him to see reality already, and asked if he really thought they could get out of the kingdom alive with just their own strength. That would be impossible even if they cut off his neck instead of his fingers. The prince was left on the ground after hearing those things, thinking it over. Meanwhile, Urick went to speak with his men, wanting to continue the mission. But if others were opposed, they could go by majority vote. Since they repelled the pursuit group, one part was done. Besides that, they were escorting someone from royalty, and the reward was enormous. One of them suggests they would need to know exactly what the job was. Before making a decision, they should know why Varka was being chased, especially by his own kingdom. Another says they should just steal the money and get rid of the rest, then just leave without worrying. Varka realizes he really might end up dying at this rate. Filion had struck a royal person hard enough to knock out a tooth. It really was incredible loyalty. But thanks to that, Varka woke up to reality. He gets up and approaches the mercenaries, introducing himself formally. He was the direct heir to that kingdom and intended to tell the truth this time. But the current regent, his uncle Duke Harmony, had set his eyes on the crown. His father had been unconscious for over a year and still hadn't woken up. So, when Varka turned 16, the throne would be passed to him. But Duke Harmony wanted to kill him before he could become the successor to the throne. That was why the prince had to reach the empire safely. If he completed his coming-of-age ceremony and returned to the kingdom with the assistance of the imperial army, Duke Harmony would no longer be able to lay a finger on him, because no matter what happened, Varka would be the sole and direct heir for Kana. Urick thinks that the essence of the mission hadn't changed that much. The scale had just increased from a common noble family to a dispute between royal family members. Varka says that if he succeeds the throne, he would grant compensation and treatment worthy of a king, and he promises that in the name of Ru, the sun god. Urick asked the others if they had heard those words. They comment among themselves that they wanted to continue. It was a chance to change their lives. Varka thinks that because Filion broke a vow made to his god, his soul would face eternal agony in the afterlife, and he prays to the benevolent and generous Ru to recognize his loyalty, to forgive him for his sins and the actions taken. Then Filion approaches, mentioning that he did a good job. Varka says he would ensure the reward for such great loyalty. As soon as he becomes king, he would ask the Pope for his indulgence, even if it required billions of gold coins. He didn't want to allow his soul to wander this world. So Filion holds the prince's hands, reminding him that a vow made in the name of Ru is only for those who don't trust each other. To him, it wasn't necessary for the prince to do that because his word alone was enough. Then Varka swears in his own name, not in Ru's. During the night, some men tend to Filion's wounds, saying that for the amount of blood spilled, the injuries were actually mild. Only the skin was cut and his muscles were fine. Filion wonders if Urick did it on purpose and for what reason. If he wanted to continue the mission knowing about the lives, he could have just ignored his actions from the beginning. Suddenly, Urick appears to talk to Filion, commenting that he must have lost a lot of blood and suggests eating something. Filion replies that it was a strange thing to say, especially coming from the man who left him like that, but he thanks Urick. Urick says he understood the reason they had lied. If he had revealed the truth right from the beginning, they wouldn't have accepted the mission. In the end, his decision was the most correct. They only got this far because Filion lied up until now, and he says not to hold too much of a grudge against him. A mission being different from the truth was the same as mercenaries betraying and also taking the life of their employer. That's just how things usually were. Honestly, it was a situation where Filion couldn't say anything, even if they took his head and his master's. Filion says he held no grudge over it. In fact, that was a small price to pay. But he still wanted to ask Urick something important. Urick asks if he would ignore the question if he refused to answer. But even so, Filion asks why he revealed the lie, especially if he wanted to continue the mission anyway. Again, he didn't mean to hold a grudge. He was just curious. Urick replies that he really did want to continue the mission. That was because he wanted to go to the imperial capital. But now that he knew Varka was royalty, he could see the sovereign of the world, the emperor. That happiness made Filion laugh, but Urick was quite pleased with it. The noble houses and castles he had seen were all very beautiful, but being the emperor, it must be even more so. But either way, Urick would never betray or lie to his brothers, especially for a personal desire. That was all. When he found out Filion hadn't been entirely honest, and that he held responsibility, Urick knew he had to tell his brothers. It was as simple as that, but Filion could trust that guy. He might be a barbarian, but he was loyal to his vows and fulfilled his duties. He must be loved by Ru more than someone like him who, even after swearing, lies so easily. That makes Filion grumble that it was all troublesome. He had a good impression of the man who tore off his fingers. Time passes, and so they continue telling the mercenaries about the situation. Duke Harmony was currently ruling the kingdom of Forcana as regent. Urick asks if, in that case, he wasn't basically the king, and Filion explains that he simply didn't have the qualifications to succeed the throne. And Varka proudly states that he was the rightful heir to the kingdom. The protagonist sighs when he hears the word rightful because it was complicated. It would be easier if the strongest just became king right away. Then Fillion comments on how it would be if there were always a loophole in power. That way anyone could take the throne and it would be complete chaos. Urick doesn't understand the reason, and Fillion explains that the kingdom would be divided every time the king died. Powerful lords would insist that they should be the successor, and so a bloody civil war would end up happening every time. That's why kings had to have a proper heir, someone of their own blood whom no one could deny. Urick asks if those lords could duel one another. Whoever won could be king. He still didn't see the problem. Fillion rebuts that only uncivilized barbarians would act that way. A king needed to have a noble mind in order to rule, not just strength. Then Urick points at Varka, because that kid cried and threw a tantrum, but it didn't convince him that he had a noble mind. Varka yells, embarrassed, that a mere mercenary could be so insolent. Urick laughs back because he knew Varka would keep repeating that he had noble status all the time. The prince mutters that if it weren't for his vote, he would have done worse. When he walks away, Fillion says that while the mercenaries laugh at him, in truth Varka was doing his best right now. Urick acknowledges that the young master had more courage than he expected. Those traits reminded Fillion a lot of his imperial majesty. But his royal majesty's twin sister, Princess Damia, had a much stronger temperament than Prince Varka. After all, they were raised together, and he still had too soft a heart. Urick was surprised that Varka left his sister to flee alone, and he asked if doing something like that wouldn't be dangerous. Fillion answers that there was nothing Duke Harmony could gain from it, especially by messing with Princess Damia, since women didn't succeed to the throne. That just made Urick think it was all a load of nonsense. Suddenly, Bachman tells Urick to come see something. They point to a group of horses they have found. They were betting 100,000 that he wouldn't be able to ride one no matter what. It was likely they were doing this because they knew something they shouldn't, and they were even betting 50,000 that he might pull it off. Urick walks over to ask what they were doing. Apparently, the group of men were trying to tame a wild horse. They wanted to ride it, but it was a wild horse after all. Even if they tamed it, riding it wouldn't be so simple. They just wanted to watch and laugh at those idiots. Urick bets 300,000 that the young master could do it. The others laugh at Urick, but he couldn't back down just because he was the leader. Varka approaches the horse and the soldiers ask him to be careful. But the prince was confident that things would work out. After looking at the horse, Varka pets and calms it, saying it can relax because they could all be good friends. The mercenaries comment that he was really almost pulling off. Fillion says that everyone in the kingdom knew Varka really loved horses, and so Varka adopts the horse, naming it Kilios. Later, the mercenaries were surprised because he actually tamed the horse. Even if Varka doesn't become king, he wouldn't starve if he worked with that. Bachman approaches to hand money to Urick and asks what he was doing. Urick just kept watching Varka, impressed. He never knew riding horses could be so interesting. He approached Varka thinking it was almost like he and the horse were one and the same. Varka gets nervous when Urick comes closer and asks what he wants, and he asks if he was planning to eat his horse again by any chance. The protagonist apologizes for that, but he had a request to make. He wanted to learn how to ride. When it came to that, Varka was the most skilled. This was an opportunity, and Varka thought it might be good. If he taught him, he could show the barbarian who he really was. And he agrees to teach, but reminds him that his lessons were strict. He should get ready because it wouldn't be easy at all. Later, Varka kept pressuring Urick because he was too slow. He retorts that he wasn't slow. The horse was always rejecting him. And Varka replies that he shouldn't call them just a horse like that. His name was Kilios. They listened to what was said and how they were treated. The prince just thinks that Urick would never be able to ride that easily. The prince knew the pressure that Urick exuded was far too intense. Even though it was a useful power in battle, it was still terrible for riding. If he couldn't suppress some of that pressure, it might be possible to ride a horse well trained by humans, but not Kilios. He suggests it would be better to just give up once and for all. Urick was too slow, which made him irritated for being called that so bluntly. Then Varka shows how it should be done and tells him to pay close attention. He just had to mount carefully and shows how to position his feet. Urick gets annoyed because the damn horse lets a kid ride it, but not him. Varka even rides around Urick on the horse, provoking him. When he takes a break, Urick is furious with the stupid horse. Sven says there's no way a beginner can ride a horse that was just tamed. It was only natural. But Urick retorts that the young master could do it. There's no way someone like Urick couldn't do it too. Sven agrees that he's a strong person with good reflexes, a natural warrior, and he asks if he thinks other people say they can do the same as Urick, just after seeing him fight once. Everyone is born with different talents, and being jealous of talent is a waste of time. Urick wonders if he ended up being too hasty, but even so, he wanted to be good at riding, and Sven laughed at his stubbornness. There's no way to get good at something with just one day of training, and Urick should know that very well after everything he's been through. Warriors who get good in just one afternoon aren't like that. They get better with every battle and with time. Urick never thought Varka would do something he couldn't, and he wonders if Gothel was a worse person than him just for not knowing how to fight. Sten had a lot of experience. Every word he says carries great weight. But as a warrior, he was fiercer and angrier than anyone else. That guy was a cold warrior, but also a fiery one. Bachman was skilled with words, quick to understand the situation. He knew how to influence people's moods, but his fighting ability was average. Donovan had a horrible personality, but he was very good at taking care of his comrades. He had military experience, so he led very well and was useful in battles. Varka was bad at fighting, had a bad personality, no experience, and wasn't cautious. But he was very good at taking care of horses. Urick thinks it was really cool seeing him ride earlier. And suddenly, he just compliments him for being an amazing person. He rode well as expected of someone with high social standing. Urick also wanted to ride Kilios, and he definitely wouldn't back down now. Time passes, and Urick asks Varka if he thought about abandoning the kingdom, leaving it to his uncle and focusing on taking care of horses instead. He replies that being talented with horses was also a virtue of a king. Urick asks if that's true even if he doesn't know how to fight. Varka questions what value a king has brandishing a sword on the front lines, and Urick asks if he would order others to give their lives, while he himself is reluctant to do it, which was funny. He didn't understand people who give up their lives following such orders. Varka responds that person's lineage and status, along with their loyalty and virtue, were things a barbarian could never understand. The protagonist agrees he didn't understand such a bizarre system. Even if he lived for hundreds of years, it would still be difficult for him. At that, Varka says that even so, Filion liked him, even being the one who tore out his fingers and hurt his back. He thought at first that Filion had gone crazy. Urick tells him that 4 of his brothers died on a fake mission. A few fingers were a low price to pay by comparison. Varka says Filion himself ended up saying the same thing earlier. When asked if he was dissatisfied, Varka agrees that he was. He was dissatisfied with many things, but he had still made a vow. When he becomes king, he would give great rewards to the mercenaries. He had no intention of getting revenge on them at all. He recommended that the leader of the mercenaries start thinking about what reward he wanted. He could ask for a mountain of gold to return home with glory. Urick wonders if returning home with glory would really be like that. More time passes, and the mercenaries just watch Urick's failures. They truly thought the leader couldn't even get on the horse. They laughed because they could bet on it and make money. Suddenly, voices come from a distance yelling for them to identify themselves. They were sentries and wanted to know why they were camping there. The mercenaries saw that they were on horseback, and they wonder why the sentries were patrolling so far out. The men even question whether the border wasn't supposed to be right there. They better answer quickly before they're treated like bandits. Bachman agrees that it would be better to answer them right away. The more they drag this out, the more suspicious they'll seem. The others comment that Varka was a prince, and wonder if the men wouldn't kneel if they revealed his identity. Others think the opposite. They might want to capture him instead. Filion replies that it was too late. Some of them had gone to call the border guards. Urick asks the soldiers how many guards there were, and apparently, if they were from the Oracle Gate, which was the closest one, there were about 200 soldiers in the garrison. Besides that, there should be around 50 horses nearby as well. Urick replies that in that case, it would be fine. He meant that if they ran, they'd only have 50 people chasing after them. Filion mentions that war horses still had great stamina. They could easily catch up, carrying at least 2 men each, so they'd be fighting against at least 100 men in total. Bachman warns that the mercenaries were all hesitating. If they fought, there would surely be people deserting in the middle of the battle. The goal of mercenaries was to survive and earn money. They would never enter a losing battle, even if it were paid for. Sten asked if he could suggest something. There might be a way to avoid the fight. Seeing how uneasy the sentries were, it was likely they had received news, and news coming directly from Duke Harmony himself. It could also be that they received false information about the prince being missing, or maybe even kidnapped. He meant they were looking for a blue-eyed boy. Urick asks if Varka himself was to blame for that, and he replies that if the prince left on horseback now, they wouldn't catch him, not even with the war horses that would go after him. Then they could cross the border and reach the meeting point in Balgma. If they did that, even if they were inspected, they wouldn't find the blue-eyed boy. That way, they wouldn't have to start a conflict. Urick agrees it was one way of doing things, but asks who would go with him. Filion replies that it should be Urick who takes care of the royal prince as the leader of the group. He was shocked. It didn't even make sense to leave at a time like this. Even so, Filion says that Sten could pretend to be the leader. In fact, his oppressive appearance made him look more like the leader. Sten agrees, laughing that it really was a great idea. Urick protests that he didn't want to. It felt like he was running away. Then Sven stops him, saying that if everyone were like him, or if they wanted to go to the Hill of Swords, they all would have decided to fight. But right now, Urick was the leader of a mercenary group. After getting furious, Urick asks Varka if he could ride Kilios. He replies that if he's going after him, there wouldn't be a problem for now. Urick tells him they should hurry and not waste time there. With that, they move away, and Filion prays for his well-being during the journey. Meanwhile, they report to Margrave Oracle that they received a document. It stated that Prince Varka was missing. Oracle realizes that the battle for the future king was finally beginning. In the end, the prince decided to seek shelter in the Empire and ask for their help. Now Oracle thinks that the previous king raised a very weak successor. Even in this era of peace and no wars, a brat with no experience was still trying to lead an army to become king. It would be truly absurd, and the soldiers keep talking, telling Oracle that the border sentries discovered a group of mercenaries. Oracle thinks that if he didn't escape by boat, he'd definitely try to blend in with them. especially to try to leave the kingdom and shake them off. According to the report, the group was likely the Urick brothers, because they had recently passed through the Larman Gate. There were rumors about them fighting against the Silver Lion mercenaries. If the rumors were true, they couldn't be underestimated. So Orkul went to meet Sven, wanting to know who their leader was. When he found him, he learned that the leader was a barbarian. One of the soldiers says he heard that the leader of the Urick brothers was a barbarian. They believe it must really be this man. Sven introduced himself as Urick, and the others held back their laughter. Orkul says that, as the one responsible for guarding the gate, he had the duty and authority to monitor and inspect anyone crossing the border, and asks if they had any complaints about that. When Sven denies it, Orkul orders the soldiers to confirm their identities. Orkul reflects that not everything in the rumors was false. It looked like everything was a mess, but their weapons and shields were within reach. They were always prepared at all times for battle. They confirmed that there was no one with blue eyes there, and Orkul orders them to check the surrounding area as well, because there might be people hiding somewhere around. He orders one of the men to raise his head. It was Filion. Filion had said before that he and Orkul had only met twice. Sven showed Orkul that that man wasn't a mercenary, but a thief. They cut off his fingers after he tried to steal their things. Orkul ignores it and orders them to hide the slave's disgusting hand. At that moment, he saw horse tracks that hadn't dried yet. However, there was no horse nearby, which brought a smile to Orkul's face. When the inspection ended, Filion asked if they might have noticed, and Sven replied that even if they had, a quarter of the day had already passed. They couldn't catch up considering how far away they must be by now. Orkul ordered someone to go along with the group to watch the mercenaries, to split the cavalry group into 5 squads and send them to hunt, because now he was sure the prince had escaped with the missing horse. Meanwhile, Varka was questioning what Urick was doing all of a sudden. He was covering himself in feces because it was the best way to disguise himself, since Varka had said earlier that Kilios saw him as a predator due to his pressure. But Urick just told him to stay away and not even dare sit near him. Urick asked what they would do if a pursuit team came after them. It wouldn't kill him to get his clothes dirty a little. Then, Urick touched Kilios and introduced himself politely. Later, they were on the horse and Urick was all happy riding. Now he could understand how things looked from atop a horse. Varka wondered if this was the best Filion could come up with. Apparently, all the bridges to cross the border had been cut. It was because they were bridges the sentries no longer paid attention to. They had been built by people like woodcutters and hunters to make their work easier, and when the sentries found out, they destroyed them. Varka sighed, never imagined someone like him would have to look for such a bridge. Suddenly, the horse stopped walking and Urick wondered what was wrong. He asked if Kilios was tired and laughed because he had even less stamina. Varka complained because they were being mean to him, especially since Urick was super heavy and they'd been riding for a long time. It didn't take long for Urick to point to something in the forest. Stemmen riders had already gathered nearby, and he grumbled that this was indeed a problem, worried if the others were okay. The prince told him to worry about himself first. If they got caught, Varka might be imprisoned, but Urick would definitely be killed. Kilios' breathing was unstable, and he was trembling, clearly exhausted. Urick told Varka to turn the horse around. It was time for a mountain battle. The prince retorted because there were still 7 of them there, and Urick said there were 2 of them, so they got 3 or 4 each. It might actually be easier than they were expecting, but Varka didn't even know what kind of madness he was suddenly talking about. Even so, Urick wanted them to turn the horse. They could let him rest a bit and asked Varka to trust him. After hesitating, Varka did as he said, replying that he trusted Filion, not Urick. Even so, Urick intended to show he didn't become the leader just because he was pretty. When they reached the group of soldiers, Urick charged at them. They thought it was total chaos and figured he was a real madman. Urick shouted at Varka to move now and he was confused about what to do. But Urick used that to his advantage to distract the soldiers and attack them. Varka just watched in a daze, wondering what this all was. He couldn't even believe the 2 of them were the same species. When Urick came back after defeating them all, he commented on how he could handle it from the start. Meanwhile, Orkul asked what his men were doing, when they should have already gotten to arrest those guys once and for all. But they replied that Urick was a freak. He didn't even seem human. Orkul grumbled that they were all cowards and said he'd lead the attack himself. At the same time, they finally found an intact bridge. They could cross and cut the ropes so no one else could follow them. Varka asked Kilios to hold on just a little longer. They just had to cross the bridge and they could reach their destination. But the horse lay down, unable to move, and Varka turned around. Urick asked if he intended to leave the horse behind, even after saying he was so connected with him. In the end, he just used him while he could, and then discarded him. Varka told him to shut up. Of course, he didn't want to leave him behind. Kilios couldn't move even if he wanted to. Suddenly, Urick heard noises coming from nearby. The guys were approaching. Varka ran and said Urick should hurry too. But he just stood still, and the prince asked what he was doing. Urick replied that he liked Kilios and wanted to take him along. So Urick went back to carry the horse with his own strength. If he saw courage like that, he also wanted to return it with his own courage. Varka watched in shock because that guy was really insane. Urick continued crossing the bridge and Orkul's group watched it all, somewhat shocked. When they crossed, Urick told Varka to cut the ropes now. After doing so, he reminded Urick that they still had to hide. Oracle prepared himself. It didn't matter that they cut the bridge ropes, because he had a crossbow and could shoot from afar. In fact, it didn't seem like Urick was the type of guy who would die there. So he ordered his men to retreat because he was satisfied showing respect for his tenacity. The soldiers decided to focus on finding another bridge since there should be one nearby. Oracle thought that the more vitality his prey had, the more it was worth. If only he could face Urick directly and take his head, that would be better. Doing that just made him feel younger. He remembered times when his son tried to speak with him, but he told him to go away. The soldiers came to inform Oracle that Urick's brothers had passed through the gate. They had assigned people to track them. Based on the direction they were taking, they wanted to regroup in Balma. Oracle ordered a letter to be sent to Duke Harmati. He even personally mobilized his soldiers to capture and bring the prince back himself. He would now take 10 of his strongest soldiers. The soldier asked if he planned to follow them past the border on his own. If the captain of the defense guard left his post, it would be a problem. Oracle replied that he was tired of that formal position. Now he would hunt his prey where his real battle was. He had forgotten, due to the barbarian assimilation policy, but the notorious nickname of Margrave Oracle was the Barbarian Hunter. Oracle ordered to be left alone. They would depart after a bit of rest. Later, the Margrave's son appeared, wanting to talk. Oracle said he was busy and asked if they couldn't do it later. Still, the son said he wanted to study abroad, in the imperial capital Hamel. That made Oracle question the reason for it. He could take exceptional classes in fencing and military science right there, and he asked that his son thought he was the weakest of the Empire's knights. The son denied it. It was because he wanted to focus on academic studies. There were people saying they had many applicants entering the Imperial Academy. All the intellectuals and scholars of the North and South gathered in one place. This enraged Oracle, who slammed the table to yell at his son, asking if he wanted to become an idiot who sits all day long, when he didn't even have any strength in that skinny body. A man only needed to know how to read and write the basics. That day, Oracle had seen a certain warrior who might be an enemy, but was a real man. While being chased, he carried an exhausted horse. He carried a horse in his arms with nothing but a human body. The son replied that no matter how strong he was, he didn't understand the point of it. The era of achieving great feats with a sword was over. The North and South had been conquered. There weren't enemies everywhere to cut down. Oracle got irritated and said they'd talk later. He needed rest now. Even after his son left, he reflected that nothing had changed. He was certain of that. Later, he visited the graves of his old comrades, Zuzbo and Hakan, the barbarian warriors who left scars on his chest. They were still strong even in death, but Oracle was growing old. A blade only shone when it had an enemy to defeat. No matter how skilled a warrior was, he couldn't defeat time. Old age was truly a horrible thing, so he thought. Meanwhile, Varka was trying to wake Urick up. He had pushed himself too hard, bringing Kilios to the other side of the bridge. He asked him not to die like this and prayed to the sun god Ru. He didn't want Urick's soul to be taken just yet. Varka asked if Urick was still alive and confirmed it by seeing he was breathing. It was a relief. Now Varka himself could breathe. Suddenly, he heard voices recognizing sounds, and Varka dragged Urick. He was too heavy, and Varka struggled to carry him. It didn't take long before Varka had to hide, leaving Urick behind. The men asked if the horse belonged to that guy. He didn't even wake up with them nearby, and they wondered if he was dead. They checked and saw that Urick was still alive and that his body was that of a good fighter. Varka got worried because he had left him behind after failing to carry him. The soldiers saw the sharp weapons and figured they must be worth money. Another suggested they should kill Urick just to be safe. The prince knew he had to do something to save his life, and wondered if he could defeat those three men. If things continued like this, he'd be left with no choice. But Varka ended up getting caught. A man drags him and says he found someone hiding. The men comment that it was a guy with a pretty face. Varka questions whether those idiots even knew who he was. The men talk about how long it's been since they last saw a woman. He was so handsome, just as much as many girls out there. One of them says they should focus on killing Urick before he wakes up. He leaves the other three messing with Varka and laughing at his pale, smooth skin. Varka couldn't believe it, and he thinks of Filion and his sister Damia. Instead of being humiliated like this, maybe it would be better to take his own life. But then the man who tried to kill Urick fell to the ground, and everyone turned to see that Urick had woken up. The protagonist sighs when he sees the situation, unable to believe he didn't understand these civilized people. Varka tells him to shut up and save him already. Urick might have spent a lot of energy on the bridge, but 3 bandits were easy, and he comments that it was very rude to force someone after they said no. Still, the men used Varka as a hostage, asking if they wanted to see him die. But Urick threw the hatchet and took the guy down in a second. Hostages don't work with him, but if Varka died, he would deal with them in a way 3 times more painful than usual. When the fight ended, Urick sighed. He would never do anything like this again. It felt like he lost at least a year of his life from being so tired. Meanwhile, Varka just yells for them to untie him already, and Urick laughs at the prince who looked like an idiot, wishing the others could see him like that. Varka asks if he could still move. It would still take another 2 days to reach Balma. They would have to keep moving now to get there in time, and he wonders if the rest of the group would be okay since they were caught fleeing. Urick agrees they could only pray that the others would be fine. and since they wouldn't be able to catch them by force to get information, they would probably end up leaving the group alone for a while. The prince says that now that they've crossed the border, they wouldn't be able to pursue them with the entire troop. And if they did, it would be a small group gathering. Urick agrees they would have to walk and be careful to preserve Kilios and his stamina. On the way, Varka asks him if everyone in his tribe was as strong as him, and he replies that no, Urick was just too strong. The prince laughs, asking if he ate something strange when he was younger. Or maybe his parents were like that too, and Urick answers he didn't have parents. His tribe found him when he was still a baby, walking alone through the plains. So they took him in to raise as part of the team. If he had to choose his parents, it was the tribe that raised him in that case. Varka feels he shouldn't have asked something like that. Anyway, Urick asks what the imperial capital was like. He replies that he had only been there once with his father when he was a child. It was 10 years ago, but Varka still remembered it like it was yesterday. It was the first time he saw a tower as tall as the one before. At the time, he thought it had been built by giants, not humans. Urick wonders if the civilization of the imperial capital was really that amazing. His brothers back home wouldn't believe it if he told them about something like that. Just like they didn't believe the ocean existed until they saw it with their own eyes. Their world was vast. They had to leave their little world. If his brothers saw the blue sea, the golden fields, and all that wheat, the civilized lands, the imperial capital, there were so many other things. When Urick stopped moving, Varka calls him to try to wake him. Then he says they could rest there for a bit. It was almost time to sleep anyway, and they couldn't keep wandering. Even worried, the prince agrees and they get ready to rest. Varka says his sister Damia would be sad if she saw this. Urick comments on how they always talked a lot about his sister. He replies yes, because they were twins born from the same mother. He loved his sister more than anyone else in his life. If he became king, he didn't plan to let his sister have an arranged marriage. Urick asks if she was beautiful, and the prince laughs. She was the most beautiful and wonderful woman in the entire kingdom, to the point of making young nobles line up to propose to her. He also said she was a blonde girl with blue eyes. Urick asks what her body was like, and Varka gets angry at the vulgar question. At that, the protagonist laughs and decides to step away for a moment before coming back later. When they go quiet for a moment, Varka asks if they were going the right way. And Urick replies not to worry too much about it. No matter where they went, if he was with him, he wouldn't die, so he could calm down. The two lie on the ground. Since it was cold, they lay close to each other. Urick says they just had to endure it, as long as they didn't light a fire. They wouldn't get caught, even if they had to endure the cold. The prince says that if he ever became king, he would kill all the traitors. Surprised, the protagonist asks if he was sure he would make it that far. And Varka agrees the emperor would surely help the legitimate heir to take the throne. Urick reflects that the civilized should know more about society than he does. Suddenly, they hear barking and get up abruptly. The protagonist didn't think they'd be smart enough to bring dogs too. The prince gets worried, asking if they should flee on Kilios. But Urick asks him to calm down. There was no guarantee it was the search team. And even if it was, there shouldn't be many of them there. They were still in the forest, which was much better. He leaves, telling Varka to hide there while he dealt with them before coming back. Varka realizes he's ended up alone again, just watching Urick. He wanted to be like Urick, a capable person who wasn't afraid of anything. When he noticed, he was still trembling after everything that had happened. Varka was someone who couldn't even protect himself without depending on someone else, and he wonders how many countless times he had received help from others in his life, suddenly questioning if he was truly worthy of becoming king. Later, Orkel ended up discovering that all the soldiers leading the vanguard had died. Instead of fleeing, they apparently planned to be attacked. Seeing how his men died, it was obvious they were running from the pressure he exerted. A soldier tells Orkel that those men were knights who gave their lives, all just to learn swordsmanship. They weren't the kind to die easily. Orkel replies that he understood the knights had great equipment. They also had enough skill to defeat their enemies. But the barbarians managed to kill those knights using terrible weapons. But that was because they had overwhelming strength, the kind that could turn even a single blow into a fatal one instantly. It seemed the blood on the bodies hadn't even dried completely yet. Therefore, Orkel knew they couldn't be too far now. The soldier comments that even though finding that barbarian is important, ensuring the prince's safety still comes first. If the prince manages to reach Hannibal and gets an audience with the emperor, everything would end up being in vain. They who expelled the prince's army from the kingdom's border became traitors. Orkel asks if he thought he had forgotten his duty or something like that. After all, Varka couldn't do anything alone on his own. As soon as they captured the barbarian, capturing the prince would be easy. The soldier apologizes, saying he just wanted to remind him. The Lord understood his concern. They were all gossiping among themselves that he'd gone mad. But war was very hard to endure without going a little mad. When he was young, Orkel was a knight of a small kingdom, and during the subjugation of the barbarians, he was always forced into the vanguard of battles. He lost everything on those battlefields, his friends and retainers. But now it seemed there was a policy of inclusion for barbarians. Those men who supposedly read a few children's books now were calling themselves human like them, even though they were all barbarians. And now, after forcing them into those horrible battles, they were hunted and treated as if they were criminals for what they did. The title Barbarian Hunter shouldn't be a dishonorable reputation. It was a name he had received with much pride. Therefore, for the kingdom and for them, the civilized, he had killed the barbarians. Before the previous emperor declared that barbarians were like them, of course, the soldier saw that his lord was furious and asked him to calm down. Orkle was a better knight than all the others and was therefore recognized. Orkle says that the only barbarians they knew were the slaves, and still, they thought real barbarians were like that. None of them knew, including the young soldiers like them. None of them truly knew the cruel existence of the barbarians. Everyone had forgotten their true nature, and one day, the moment they stood before a real barbarian, they would completely regret it right then and there. Meanwhile, Urick was watching the soldiers from atop the trees. Since they were all grouped together, they must have understood his combat method. He wouldn't be able to kill them one by one this time. But if they kept walking down this path, they would find Varka soon. In any case, regardless of how easy or hard it was, he had to deal with them there. The problem was that Urick would be the first to die if he jumped in the middle. A warrior who charges forward even knowing he will die reminds him of Sven. The only reason the slave Sven bought used his life as a tool was because he had a resting place called the Hill of Swords waiting for him. Taking a deep breath, the protagonist feels that he must choose now. If his limit now was only 4 or 5 of them, then he would try to push past that limit right now and make it work. With that, Urick leaped at them and the men shouted that the barbarian had appeared. It didn't take long for him to take down several more in quick succession. Their reactions were good and fast. It seemed he had brought the elite among the guards who defended the gate. Urick backed away from the attack when he saw Orkle appear and charge at him. He was all too happy to show them a real barbarian in the flesh, and he ordered them to shoot Urick, but he dodged with skill. He was hit by a few arrows, but he was still moving. The soldiers shouted to aim at the head because it was more important. But Urick said those strange weapons took too long to attack. The soldiers were shocked and realized they were fallen. If they managed a decent flank attack, they might have killed him in one charge. There was no reason to lose there. Even so, they wondered how their soldiers were falling, without understanding what was going wrong in that battle. The fear of dying if they attacked first was terrifying. They were so frightened by that pressure, and it was all coming from just one person. The spirit of the barbarians their lord had spoken of before now came from Urick. The dying soldier remembered the things Orkle had told them before. When all the soldiers had fallen, only Orkle remained, commenting that Urick looked pretty injured by the looks of it. Those men were so terrified by his madness that all of them fell by Urick's hands without even realizing it. Orkle drew his sword, ready to show his eyes that saw everything. He wouldn't be fooled. He was used to overwhelming fear. Urick had lost so much blood that he felt his vision blur. Meanwhile, Orkle could see that the barbarian was reaching his limit. The protagonist knew he needed to think. At this rate, he would die. As Orkle charged at Urick, suddenly they both stopped when they heard a horse. When they looked, it was Varka who appeared, shouting for Urick. The protagonist was surprised to see the prince show up to help him. He knew he had to save Urick and ran to pick up a weapon from the ground. Varka pointed the crossbow at Orkle, who realized he was in trouble. It would be dangerous to take a bolt at that short distance, so Orkle raised his shield. He only heard the sound of the crossbow being fired, but it seemed nothing hit him, and he wondered if he had missed the shot. As expected, Varka had terrible aim and missed his attack. If the prince hadn't interfered, he would have ended the barbarian's life. That's when Orkle saw that Urick was approaching from the other side, and was surprised that he still had the energy to move. Even so, Urick managed to hit Orkle squarely with all his strength. He apologized for not finishing him in one strike, but he would finish him immediately with his sword now. When the battle ended, Urick collapsed to the ground from how exhausted he felt, and asked why Varka came when he told him to wait and hide. Either way, Urick was still alive because of him even when he thought he would die. Varka turns and wonders if Urick really did all that on his own. He replies that he didn't know why he came either. He thought maybe he was just afraid of hiding alone. Varka extends his hand and helps Urick sit up, who still couldn't believe it. When it came to cowardice, he really was the best at hiding. The prince responds that it actually wasn't quite like that. He thought maybe he was just afraid of becoming a coward who only hides, especially because one day he would become king. So even trembling, Varka picked up the sword from the ground and sheathed it. He helped take care of Urick's wounds, and the protagonist tries to confirm his real name. Varka says his real name again to him, but he was worried because Urick's condition was really bad. He had fought hard with his body injured and exhausted. The protagonist says that if he doesn't wake up the next day, even if his body is cremated, he shouldn't forget to cut a bit of his hair, and also to throw it from the top of the celestial ridge. When Urick passed out, Varka became worried and tried to check if he was still alive. He sighs, realizing that thinking about it now, what Urick did was absurd. Varka couldn't even believe that he managed to face so many soldiers alone. It was something he could brag about for the rest of his life for having done. And the prince acknowledges that someday Urick would become a famous sword master. But Varka wonders what would happen to himself. Even though if he was becoming a king or trying to, he didn't know if he was worthy of it. If he were a stable boy or a farmer, it would be fine to be a coward. But he was someone who was actually going to claim the crown. And above all, he wasn't anything special compared to the others. Even though he had lost so much blood, Urick was still very heavy. So Varka prepared to drag him using a rope along the way. His hands were injured and dirty, but that made him smile. They could now travel beside his course to the kingdom. When they arrive at the kingdom, word spread that Urick's condition looked bad. It wouldn't be a bad idea to prepare a new leader in case something worse happened. Filion entered Urick's room to speak with Varka, warning that the mood among the mercenaries was quite serious. Bachman agrees because they also were on good terms, especially being alone, so they should talk quickly. If Urick didn't wake up, Filion asks who would be the next leader. Bachman replies that even if he wanted to, the others wouldn't accept him. Sven and Donovan were the best candidates, but Sven had no interest in those things. Even though mercenary groups usually continue the mission after the leader's death, nothing could be guaranteed in this case, and personally, if Donovan became the leader, Bachman would leave the group too. That's why Bachman mentally prays for Urick to wake up soon. When they leave the room, Filion tells Varka that he will make a request to another mercenary group. Still, Varka remembers that Urick wasn't dead. He was thinking a bit too far ahead now. Ru was watching. They couldn't go and break their promise, especially since nothing had happened yet. Filion was in disbelief because Varka said such things. Varka continues saying that Urick was a man of integrity. His skills were exceptional too and recognized by everyone. As long as they still agreed, he would risk his life to save him. Even if they hired another mercenary group, they would never find someone like him. Instead, they should stay alert around them, because they might be part of the pursuit group that was tracking them. A true noble mind wasn't something you gained just by talking about it. In that case, the prince would look for someone who could cure Urick's illness, so he wanted them to stay aware of the mercenary group's movements. As expected, royal blood really did flow through Varka's veins. The problem was the environment he lived in before, but his actions had changed now. Bachman left with Varka saying that Nanimet Doctor had found the solution, and asked if there was any other plan in that case. He had read the records from the Northern Campaign as well as those from the Southern Campaign. They were books the former emperor wrote while conquering the barbarians. The barbarians knew more about their bodies than they did, who were civilized if he would find someone like them. Varka entered a tavern and said he was looking for a barbarian, and asked if by any chance he knew someone who fit, paying for the information. The tavern man smiled, asking if he was referring to a shaman. He wasn't sure, and suddenly he yelled at a woman nearby. She was trying to flee, and the man stopped her so she paid the money, saying that the only place that would hire a barbarian woman like her was there. She replied that she intended to pay the money, complaining about being called a thief. When she saw she was being watched, she approached Varka, commenting that he was handsome and asking if he wanted something with her. The prince asks if she was really a barbarian after hearing her accent. The man says Juneva was a barbarian who sold her own body. She was a woman who would do anything asked of her as long as she was paid. Varka decides to take some time to search for a healer, and they agree to come back later. While walking, the mercenary mentions that Juneva was following them. The woman comments that she heard he was looking for a barbarian healer. Varka agrees, but it was a healer, not a woman like her. She replies that for barbarians, a good healer meant a skilled shaman, and a skilled woman was someone who comforts wounded warriors, those who came back from a long battlefield. So it was the perfect profession for women in that case. Later, Urick had woken up when Juneva went to see him. Varka explains that she was a healer he brought to care for his condition. Urick asks if she was a shaman, and Juneva comments that his fever still hadn't gone down. At least that's what it seemed from the way she was speaking now. Varka mentions that he didn't bring her here to say things like that. She replies that everyone receives vitality when they're born, but for Urick, the vitality that is normally spent throughout an entire lifetime was now about to run out, and that was probably why he had fallen ill. Urick asks if that was really the case, and Juneva continues her explanation. A normal person with that much vitality could use it their whole life and still have some left. He wouldn't be able to overcome his illness. His vitality was reaching its end. Urick gave a faint laugh, practically understanding that he was going to die, and he apologizes to Varka because he wouldn't be able to complete his mission. He had wanted to see the imperial capital too, but Varka wasn't satisfied and dragged Juneva outside, calling her a cultist, and he wanted to find someone better than her for the job. Outside, Juneva mentions that she never said she couldn't treat him, and the prince pressures her to speak clearly and stop joking around. She replies that if someone's vitality runs out, you just have to put more in. If given 3 days, she could come back with a remedy for Urick, one capable of filling all his vitality back up. She just needed 2 million as an advance payment, and another 8 million after it was done. Varka says that if she needed materials to buy, he could do that in her place. After all, he would never trust a woman like her with an advance payment. Juneva replies that she would make an oath in the name of the sun god, but the prince couldn't believe in the oath of a woman like her, especially because she was a barbarian and they usually weren't religious. He asks if the sun god she's referring to is Ru, which makes her comment on how strict he was. In that case, they could pretend that none of this happened so far. However, Varka still thinks about Urick and tells Juneva he would pay the advance, as long as she guarantees that she can heal Urick and save his life. She says it would be 10 million, and she could make the oath in the name of the sun god Ru. Varka swears in the name of the sun god that if she heals Urick, he will pay the 10 million, and she smiles because she was sure the god had heard those words. Urick was dreaming of grassy lands and a golden sun. He wonders if he was really thinking about his home now. It really felt like his final moments before dying. He had really wanted to spread civilization there too. Ru, the sun god, and reincarnation. If he died like this, he wondered if his soul would truly be purified. Could he forget everything and be born again as a different person? Meanwhile, Varka helps Urick drink so he can recover. Earlier, a mate had delivered Juniva's remedy called the Stew of Life. Varka hadn't paid her to bring food, and that irritated him. He stepped out to go look for Juniva and asked a mercenary to accompany him. It would be dangerous to waste more time there, and Varka was getting irritated. If Urick didn't get better, he'd have no choice but to leave him behind. There were many people who followed and trusted him and the path he was on. Now he had to bear this burden and move forward. He would reach the end of this path and become the king that everyone needed. That's why Varka prays for Urick to wake up soon. If he couldn't accompany him, he would have to abandon him. They returned to the tavern, where the man comments he didn't expect to see him again so soon. He hadn't managed to find any barbarian healer. But the prince only asks where Juniva was. He replies that he hadn't seen her since the last time they were there, and asks if she stole his money or something like that. Varka asks if the man even knew where she lived or anything like that, and he replies that a man's house is any house of a woman who sells her body. At that, the prince warns him to say something if he sees her. If he does, there will be a reward. The man comments that suspicious outsiders like them shouldn't be walking around. That's because another incident had happened recently. Apparently another child was kidnapped during that time. It must have been the work of those remaining snake guys. The next day, Filion told Varka that they had no more time to waste. They have to leave right away as soon as possible. The prince asked about the mercenaries, and apparently they were choosing their next leader. At first, they wanted to stay quiet. Those who wished to remain in the group should vote. Filion thought they couldn't trust Donovan. He was a realistic person. They didn't know when they could be betrayed, using the leadership change as an excuse. If they wanted to keep working with them, they'd need to receive a new oath. At least it seemed that Donovan was a devout follower of Ru. Varka then announces to the mercenaries that they would be departing starting that day. After they finished cleaning up the internal structure of the group and had chosen a new representative, he told them to speak with him. Donovan comments on how the prince seemed to have changed a bit. When they were talking about who would be the new leader, Donovan volunteered. He believed he was the best choice because of his military experience, and he had also been in the group since its foundation. Another person stepped up to compete with Donovan for the leadership. It was Bachman, who says he knew he wasn't as good at fighting as Donovan or Urick, but he could still try his best to make the group profitable. And he questions the others to see if they wanted to follow a rude leader like Donovan. He was almost certain he had no real chance of winning, but even so, Bachman had to try, and he did. Donovan never expected to see him want to become a leader. Bachman replies that he also had qualifications for it. It wasn't just combat skills that were necessary to become a leader, and Donovan agrees with that, while other men talk among themselves. Those who wanted to quit mercenary life or abstain could step aside. Suddenly, Bachman wonders what that reaction from Donovan was. It was a strange reaction for the man he knew. A man says those voting for Bachman should go to the left. Those who prefer Donovan could move to the right, and they should hurry because the result needed to be decided quickly. The numbers were closer than Bachman expected. He was actually starting to think he might win this. Donovan confesses that he never liked Bachman to begin with, and he replies that it was quite a coincidence because he felt the same. He always hated his face ever since they were gladiators in the past. Bachman's thought process for entering the competition was obvious to Donovan. If he won, he'd become the leader. If not, he'd leave the mercenary group. Then Bachman didn't understand why something felt wrong. There were mercenaries from Donovan's group voting for him instead of Donovan. In the end, the vote ended in a tie to Bachman's surprise. It seemed Donovan had prepared for this a long time ago. Donovan said the one who received Ru's favor would become the mercenary leader. Now he could understand what he had been thinking from the start. He wanted the leader's position and also Bachman's head. Donovan told him to pick up his sword or lick his feet like a dog. Meanwhile, Urick was still unconscious, dreaming of his homeland, until he awoke in some strange place that even surprised him. Meanwhile, Donovan and Bachman were dueling with their swords. As expected from Donovan, the pressure of his blade was no joke. He wonders if this was Ru's punishment. Maybe it was a trial his lord wanted him to overcome. Instead, Donovan suggests they end this dude relationship. But before he strikes, suddenly a shield flies in and protects Bachman. Donovan complains because Sven interfered and questions him, to which Sven replies that their leader had woken up. Everyone is shocked because Urick managed to overcome the illness. In the end, they were right. He really was the best leader. Urick says the sun is high and it's time to clean everything up and leave. Donovan sighs. Bachman must have prayed a lot to Ru every day. After all, he had incredible luck to survive just in time. Then, Urick calls Donovan to talk because he wanted to have a word. Outside, Urick understands that the whole mess was his fault, because he hadn't appointed a vice leader for the team from the start. Before they left, he would announce to the other mercenaries that the vice leader of the Urick brothers would be Donovan. Donovan asks, surprised, if he expected to gain something from this, and Urick replies no, he just wanted to make a proposal. If Urick died, Donovan could keep the mercenary group, but only if he didn't take the life of any of his brothers. If Bachman had been killed when Urick woke up, he would have been killed by Urick's own hand. Donovan asks if he was trying to threaten him, and the protagonist replies that it was actually just a warning. It was the last time he should try to kill one of his brothers like that. Next time, everything would end like warriors do. When he was left behind, Donovan sighed, realizing what happened. Meanwhile, the mercenaries prepared for a quick inspection and departure. Urick asks why the guards were there, and they explain they were looking for snake tattoos on people's bodies. It seemed it wasn't just 1 or 2 children who had gone missing because of the snakes. Outside, Varka appeared saying it would take time for them to check for tattoos. Urick saw him and comments that he heard he did a lot to obtain a cure for him. He even brought him to Baldma, and after receiving so much help, he thanks him. Varka says he didn't do anything special and wonders if he really did anything at all. Seeing how Donovan didn't come to collect the rest of the money, the soup must have been a scam too. Urick agrees even without drinking the soup, he would have woken up anyway. Suddenly, they hear voices shouting for the cultists to die. They question how they could steal those children and still eat them. They wouldn't even be considered human for acting like that. The snakes scream that they were all idiots. They would only enter the next life when their flesh is shed. The serpent achieved eternal life by shedding its skin, so to be shed from this world held no meaning for them. They could all be waiting for them in the other world. Varka comments that the guy shouting was a snake believer. Urick asks if he knew what the words about the next world meant, and he replies that he didn't know anything about the snake doctrine. But from what it seemed, they believed that when they died, they would go to the next world. As soon as their bodies left this world, they received a new one in the next. Varka thought it was all complete stupidity. Their souls wouldn't receive any salvation. Suddenly, they shout that an execution was about to happen. But what really caught everyone's attention was that Donovan was in the middle of the crowd. Urick grabs Varka and says they should leave right now. If he wanted to watch people lose their heads, he just had to stay near him. The prince was confused by what he was doing out of nowhere and told him to put him down. But the protagonist doesn't let go and just carries Varka away. Donovan was the only person who knew the whole truth, but she was smiling and even seemed to be looking at Urick. Her eyes were similar to Gavel's. Snake cultists, people from the south, sun worshippers, or whoever they were. Urick hoped they could all reach the afterlife they wanted so badly. On another day, Filion was caught by surprise when Varka wanted to learn swordsmanship. He had grown quite a lot since then, and Filion was impressed. The prince mentions Urick and asks how powerful he thought he was. Filion replies that he was a warrior of considerable level. He wasn't just physically strong, but also had combat skills. They didn't match his young age. He asks if there was any knight in the kingdom who could defeat him, and Filion didn't think there was anyone in the kingdom, but in the empire, Midi-Persian. He was very old, even being a swordmaster at 70 years old. But surely someone in the Imperial Order of the Steel Knights could. Or maybe in the Order of the Warriors of the Sun, there might be someone who could defeat Urick. Then the prince asks if Filion thought he would accept an offer to become his vassal once that entire mission was over. He replies that he's not sure. They didn't even know Urick's goals. At least from what they knew, he didn't seem to desire wealth. And Varka agrees, saying he didn't ask because he wanted a specific answer. On the way, Urick ended up annoying a farmer, who shouted for him to get the barbarian out of his way. Varka went to ask Urick to stop provoking him, but then Urick asked if he knew what a mage was. And suddenly the two were curious, talking with the farmer about it.